Good day from Oslo, and welcome to participants, speakers, and panelists to our webinar, Every Street Matters. My name is Erik Berg. I'm the moderator of this event, together with Ellen Wibe, who will moderate the panel discussion with representatives of political parties towards the end of the program. If you have any questions during the course of the event, please use our mail address, habitatnorway, in one word, @gmail.com. Here you will also get written responses from the presenters during the course of the webinar. A particular welcome goes to the mayor of Oslo, Marianne Borgen, UN Habitat Director Christine Knudsen, and the Deputy Minister of Local Government and Modernisation, Heidi, Nakken. They will inaugurate the webinar. A vote of thanks goes to the Jacob Wall Foundation, who has provided funding, and the Polytechnical Association of Norway, the technical organizer. Today, the government of Norway was supposed to launch a national action plan for sustainable development and parliamentary white paper, with focus on what the government wanted to do with the SDGs towards 2030. It was regrettably not launched this morning, and work seems to be in progress. So the question, in a way, is no longer when the plan will be launched, but if it will be launched. And I hope we will get some clarification on that issue during the webinar. So with this webinar, Habitat Norway is trying to throw the perspective somewhat wider and differently than just the national Norwegian level. Our perspective is primarily the local in the global. We advocate bottom-up, not top-down delivery approaches. Accordingly, we want to use this event to listen to people with knowledge and experience, the grassroots peoples and their representatives, as well as administrators, researchers, and academics, who sometimes function as mouthpieces of people's interests. So, ladies and gentlemen, the main purpose of this webinar is to explore the role and potential of streets in urban development. We have selected a few perspectives from the 10 targets of SDG 11, trying to cover the 3 E's of sustainable development: equity, economy, and ecology. Our perspective is that the street constitutes a microcosmos of life. So this is where the vast majority of the world's population are born, live, and pass away. This is where they work, play, go to school, organize, mobilize, and struggle for their rights. Their sense of identity, belonging, and safety is created in the streets and their neighborhoods. Rural and urban cultures and traditions meet in the streets. But this is also where people cannot breathe because of political and police repression, because of air pollution, noise, and waste. Urban people the world over need to reclaim the space occupied by cars on their front doors. Streets need to be taken back for children, for walkers, for biking, for vendors, and for waste pickers. Family-friendly policies need to confront the way our governments, be they local or national, how they allocate public space, not just public fund. So movements like Slum Dwellers International, Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, women in informal employment, globalizing and organizing, WIEGO Commission and Orange pilot program of Karachi. They have a central role to play in bottom-up approaches. The SDGs cannot be achieved without their participation. So finally, I would specifically like to thank Slum Dwellers International for providing some of the ideas that this webinar is based on. I will now give the floor to Gro Lauvland to formally welcome you all on behalf of Habitat Norway, where she is a board member. She's a practicing architect, presently associate professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And last autumn, she released the book Communities, Architecture, Revolt, based on the work of Christian Norberg Schultz's theory of place. The floor is yours, Gro.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, it is an honor and a pleasure also for me to welcome participants from all continents, speakers and discussants to this webinar. Since the moderator, Erik, has taken care of the courtesies, I will continue directly with the following. Today's webinar makes a sequel to the webinar, A Change of Mindset, Perspectives on Place and Architecture as a Collective Art, which took place in Oslo last August in collaboration with UN Habitat's World Urban Campaign. Today's seminar is also a follow-up of the October 2018 conference in Trondheim, co-arranged between the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and Habitat Norway, with the topic Architecture as a Collective Art, Revolt. On behalf of Habitat Norway, drawing on its policies, but also on my own work as a teacher at the NTNU, I will start by making a reference to what was said at last year's webinar about the need for a change of mindset. There is a relation between our understanding of the world and what we make and produce. Albert Einstein's insight was that no problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it. The streets are concrete and physical. Seeing urban challenges from the street level and up implies a critique not only of an abstract way of thinking, but also of the urban development that dominates today. Habitat Norway's critique of today's city development has both an aesthetical and an ethical side. In my work, I focus mostly on the importance of an aesthetical understanding and on the importance of taking a step back. Every street matters because every single area on Earth are physical and concrete. It is part of nature and therefore unique. And we, all living creatures, are embedded in the place through our bodies and senses. Our own body is in the world as the heart is in the organism, says Merleau-Ponty. Streets, unlike roads, are made for pedestrians and cyclists of all ages, not primarily for cars. The buildings and the streets are interwoven, and it is only by understanding the significance of the place's non-measurable qualities we can take care of the historical architecture and find a new architecture that belongs to the community. Architecture is neither the same as mere building, nor is it a manifestation of a mere market economy. Being an architect implies a responsiveness to the shared qualities of a place, the qualities we have in common. This simple and obvious reality needs to be addressed not only by architects and planners, but also by entrepreneurs and politicians. Quality has always been connected to durability. High-quality architecture takes into account both nature-given conditions, the natural light, the topography and vegetation, and the built heritage. This is how the city areas, the neighborhoods, the common ground, the streets, and their buildings can be made to last. And this, of course, also has important ethical, political, and social economic implications. Such an understanding of architecture goes for buildings and streets of every scale. We have seen many good examples through the last years. Here I would like to mention the works by the Pritzker Prize winners of 2021, Lacaton and Vassal in France, and also the Orange pilot project in Karachi, as well as the new buildings by Urban Think Tank in the barrios in Venezuela and in the settlements of South Africa. And also the library and concert hall Stormen in Bodø could be mentioned. A building where the architects have been responsive to the natural qualities and the best of the buildings from the 1950s in this northern Norwegian city, a city that was heavily bombed during World War II. The streets are concrete and physical, and today the importance of understanding and improving the quality of the streets needs to be addressed in order to open up for people's experience of belonging and identity. What is and what should be are intertwined. Seen from the ethical, political, and economic field related to this understanding of place, some of the key questions for the way forward are: how can we find a way out of the housing crisis, bringing down prices and strengthening communities? Don't we need a democratic participation that includes rather than excludes people and communities? Yes, and how can we find an alternative to the market city? These are challenges increasingly relevant everywhere in the world, and also in Norwegian cities and towns. Through this webinar, Habitat Norway intends to provide a platform for concrete and specific action-oriented advice, not only to governments, but also to civil society and local authorities regarding how to approach the urban sustainable development goals. Against the background of urban population and economic growth, speculation, migration, climate change, crime and pandemics, etc., streets still serve as a function of hope. The streets provide opportunities for democratic, open urban exchange through their public areas. And at the same time, they constitute a platform for economic and social development, giving power to the powerless. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gro. We in particular take note of your call for a change of mindset in today's and future architecture and urban development. And we particularly look forward to working with you to operationalize this concept. Thank you very much. So it's now an honor and a pleasure to welcome the mayor of Oslo, Marianne Borgen, to the rostrum. She is one of Norway's most experienced urban politicians, representing the Socialist Left Party. She also has a career in Save the Children and is a sociologist by education. Take it away, Marianne.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the invitation from Habitat Norway, and thank you for hosting this webinar on the importance of public spaces and streets throughout the world. Every street matters. The sustainability challenges have been a focus area for quite some time for the city of Oslo. Oslo is growing, and so does cities all around the world. More and more people are living in cities, and the city is the arena for exchange of goods, travel modes, ideas, and love. It is the place, according to the sociologist Jon Pløger, to be seen and to observe. The place to experience the unexpected, meeting, and sometimes the arena for friction, debate, and struggle. More than half of the world's population live in cities today. And cities account for approximately 70% of all the world's total CO2 emissions. This means that cities are a big part of the climate problems, but they can also be the solution. The city of Oslo has been focusing for 50 to 20 years on sustainability, public streets, and spaces. Indeed, we, the cities, have to be a part of the solution. It is in this spirit that Oslo served as a European Green Capital back in 2019. We created a platform for sharing solutions and also a platform for change. Oslo has, in my opinion, so far a lot to be proud of. We have one of the world's most ambitious climate strategies and also a climate budget. We have proven the reduction of car traffic and implementing the car-free livability program in the city center. Many more passengers choose public transport, biking, and walking. We have a highly advanced system for turning waste into energy and other resources. We have purified the water of our 10 rivers and opened up the riverbanks for recreational purposes and improved public spaces as part of the area improvement programs for less affluent areas like Groruddalen, Søndre Nordstrand, Tøyen, and Grønland on the eastern sides of Oslo. None of this happened overnight. It was the efforts of many politicians over decades in cooperation with the regional and national level. It was not least all the NGOs and also the scientific institutions who together have challenged the city and constantly sought for new solutions. But most of all, the key to Oslo's success so far has been the people's willingness to try new solutions. It is this ability we must encourage as we continue to make Oslo even greener and greater in the future. Our years as European Green Capital was only the beginning. And none of inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. Through the C40 network, the City of Oslo learns from and also shares with different parties how our sustainability process may be improved. Common international efforts and cooperation are necessary if we are to reach our goals. In the present pandemic situation, it is of particular importance to consider how we, in the rich part of the world, may assist the more deprived areas. I would like to take this opportunity to compliment Habitat Norway for clearly illustrate how we may learn from and also support each other in our efforts to make the world more sustainable. I think also that the Norwegian central government should support the UN Habitat work as well as NGOs work on the ground throughout the world. Let us hope that this will happen in the future. In many parts of the world, the street is also the place you live, the place you grow up as a child. And I would particularly point out the challenge of making public spaces safe for children and women. We must give the streets back to our children and also take our cities back to the people. I hope today's webinar will inspire all participants to make an even bigger effort to secure urban public spaces for women, children, youth, elderly people, and everybody else that live in the city. With this, I wish you all good luck with this very important webinar and good luck with your important work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marianne. We certainly took note of your point regarding the need to take the streets and the neighborhood back for children and women. And we hope under your leadership that the municipality of Oslo will take a lead in this. And in fact, there is 70 years since you were born, since you started growing up. And we would like to take this opportunity to hand over some flowers. And we would like to thank you for being who you are. And we hope you will continue with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great. We will continue. And I would now like to invite Christine Knudsen, Director, External Relations, Strategy, Knowledge and Innovations of the United Nations Human Settlement Program to speak. She has more than 20 years of experience from humanitarian work and has been manager of UNICEF's Office of Emergency Program. I hope you are with us from Kenya, from the coast of Diana in outside Mombasa, Christian. The floor is yours.
To all participants with us today from Kenya. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I very much wish to extend on behalf of UN Habitat our thanks to Habitat Norway for allowing me to provide some remarks at this very timely webinar on the role of streets in the building of our socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable cities for all. I'd also like to provide my verbal flowers to acknowledge the great leadership of the Honorable Mayor of Oslo, Ms. Marianne Borgen, and I believe as well Mr. Nikolai Astrup, Minister for Local Government and Modernization, and his colleagues are with us today. I thank you as well for your support and presence at this important event. Your participation and the inputs of all of our colleagues today emphasize how important it is to place the street at the heart of the urban dialogue. As our earlier interventions have already said, cities, streets as the microcosm, how every street matters. This really must be at the heart of our urban dialogue to ensure that not only we build back better, but that we're addressing inequalities, leaving no one, no place, and I dare say no street behind. And perhaps just at the start of this discussion today in this event, we ask ourselves, what is a street? A literal definition I think we would all be comfortable with is a public road in a city, a town, a village, typically with houses and buildings along its corridor. Yet we also know that streets are so much more than that. They connect spaces, people, goods. They support work, trade, social interaction, and mobility. Streets in many ways define the cultural, social, economic, and political functions of cities. They help us to define the sense of place, the status of the location, the formality or the informality of an area, even from a legal point of view. And in fact, this idea of a street is quite complex. And I'd like to unpack it with three aspects which I think can help us to shape today's discussion. First is this idea of a street being a public space. And streets are presumed to be open, therefore, and inclusive of everyone, not just tailored to private cars, their owners, or their passengers, as we see in many rapidly growing cities today. These kinds of fossil fuel-driven transports are a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, unsafe roads, low air quality, high congestion, and also result in significant economic loss, mortality, and morbidity. And other users of the space, especially pedestrians and cyclists, get effectively ruled out of this presumed public space. As a result, many people see only limited opportunity to enjoy the social and economic benefits of the street and the general urban area. Access is reduced or rendered extremely hazardous. We need to ensure that all, and especially vulnerable groups, are able to access, enjoy, and make use of the street in equal measure. The street, as a public space, is vital to people's livelihoods and well-being. A second element I would like to introduce is that of the cities, towns, and villages. Now, this implies a strong urban dimension of the streets. And as noted by the mayor, we know that the world's population is more than half urban at this point and will be 2/3 urban by 2050. It's important that we invest time and expertise now in the adequate planning and management of inclusive streets for the years and decades ahead. Uncontrolled urban sprawl can only intensify the issues we are facing now of unsafety, congestion, air pollution. And COVID-19 has shown the importance of how streets and cities must be planned for health and resilience. The priorities, needs, and rights of all vulnerable groups must be at the heart of this planning. And a third element for us to take forward is that of the idea of the houses and buildings. This underlines that there is a diversity of land use and function that streets support. They not only facilitate residential living, but also economic activity, the provision of services, recreation, transport, waste management, provision of water and sanitation in a formal way, as well as informally in many cities in the global south. Ladies and gentlemen, as noted in the introductory remarks, the Norwegian government is now deliberating in many ways its policy and action plan for the SDGs. And with 9 years left until 2030, we are all challenged to redouble and focus our efforts. Norway's continued leadership will be key to this global challenge. In this context, I'd like to highlight the role or the opportunity around voluntary local reviews as one means to advance sustainable development agenda at the municipal level. UN Habitat is a steadfast advocate for local implementation of the SDGs in line with the new urban agenda, and to ensure that voluntary national reviews will build on a strong understanding of local progress and challenges. In this context, I'm very happy to share with you that we are working with the UN Economic Commission for Europe to publish regional guidelines for the development of voluntary local reviews in the ECE region. We hope that this will be a key resource for many and support more local governments to implement the SDGs in an intentional way in their cities and towns. The Sustainable Development Goals and the new urban agenda provide global guiding frameworks and targets to create urban streets that are truly public, inclusive, and meet the diverse needs of all, leaving no one behind. The sessions today, which will follow, emphasize just how important those connections are. And here, allow me to underline the idea of complete streets. Streets that are inclusive public spaces where everyone can express their identity, access opportunities, and create a sense of belonging in these spaces. Streets need to be tailored to local conditions and respond to the diverse needs of different users of the public space for us all to be able to enjoy them. Grassroots engagement like this is essential, as illustrated, for instance, by the youth-led one-stop emergency COVID-19 response in Nairobi's informal settlement called Moderator. This was supported by the government of Norway, and the youth center actually decided that providing hand-washing stations throughout the community, along with prevention information, was the best solution for their neighborhood. The project also supported the development of public space, understanding that this can enhance the quality of life for youth, can enable education and employment opportunities, and also increase security in the slums. Now, historically, urban planning has often been driven by a range of considerations, including oftentimes short-term economic gain. And that has defined the use of public space and streets in ways which dramatically reduce this deeper function in cities as places where communities engage, work, participate, and socialize. The UN Habitat City Prosperity Index, the first in the world to include streets and public spaces as a metric of prosperity and sustainability, has shown that there is a clear relation between prosperity and street networks. Indeed, for a city to be prosperous, it must have a generous and well-designed street pattern. This is why we work with so many other partners in supporting the livable street movement, advocating streets for all. That streets are the fabric of social and urban life, where safety, security, social interaction, identity, and sense of place come together. And of course, I'd be remiss if I did not note the importance of streets in the fight against the climate crisis. This year, with COP26 and the recent launch of the EU's Green Deal, as well as the COVID recovery, the momentum needs to shift from building back better to building back greener. Streets are a key factor to achieving the goal of making cities net zero and leading the charge for truly green recovery. Energy, transport, waste management, water, and sanitation all need to be provided equitably and with unhindered access. And we look forward to working and continuing our work with partners, including Habitat Norway, in delivering on this shared commitment. Finally, I would like to extend special recognition to Habitat Norway for its tremendous efforts in advocating for sustainable urbanization both at home and abroad. At UN Habitat, much of the progress we have made over the years is due to the strong partnership we've enjoyed with Norwegian stakeholders, both at government and non-government levels. We very much hope that this will continue and count on your support as we work together towards an inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable future for all. Thank you again very much for inviting us to join you today, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your valuable contribution, Christine. Habitat Norway certainly looks forward to continuing our cooperation with UN Habitat, be it for children, youth, women and gender, climate, or land rights for that matter. And in particular, we would like to work hard to advocate that the Norwegian support that was stopped for this budget year is taken up again in the coming years. We want to get back the government of Norway contribution to UN Habitat. So, next welcome words is from Heidi Nakken. She is Deputy Minister of Local Government and Modernization for the Conservative Party, with long experience from political work on municipal and county level. Take it away, Heidi.
Thank you very much. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. The Minister, unfortunately, was not able to attend, but he sends his greetings. And I am very pleased that I had the opportunity to attend in his absence. The Ministry of Local Government and Modernization is responsible for the Norwegian national implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly number 11, the Sustainable Cities and Communities. We are also responsible for policies on housing, planning, and regional local government. So the theme of today's webinar is definitely very relevant to us. Let me first give thanks to UN Habitat for their support to cities all over the world, and to regional and local governments and their work on localizing the Sustainable Development Goals. You have inspired many Norwegian local politicians. I have to also, I would like to thank Habitat Norway for convening this webinar on sustainable urban development. We hope to continue the partnership throughout Habitat's Day, Urban October campaigns, and other events and processes related to goal number 11, the so-called city goal, and a new urban agenda. We are in the decade of action, and there are already many stakeholders that have taken action, and this is indeed very positive. We want to accelerate the progress of implementing the goals in Norway. And during last year, we have been working on a white paper and an action plan. As we speak, we are about to finish this work, and it will be presented to the Parliament later this month. The work on the white paper and action plan has been a long process, not least because it has required that all ministers have cooperated across sectors. This is so important that it has to take longer time, so it is a big process. In addition, we had input from various parts of the society, such as private sector, civil society, academia, and regional and local authorities. This has been a long tour around the country, in the later times digital, but nevertheless. The white paper and the national action plan brings all the sustainable goals targets into a national policy context, where it identifies challenges and suggests national targets and possible indicators. We truly hope that this white paper will provide a common platform for the future work of the goals in Norway. At a high-level policy forum in July this year, Norway will also present a second voluntary national report, the so-called VNR. This year, it includes contributions from different stakeholders, which clearly illustrates the importance of contribution from the non-governmental sector. The VNR contains an assessment of all the goals by the civil sector, messages from academia, private sector, and the Sami parliament, and a chapter written from regional and local authorities. Both of these processes have shown us that just how important it is to mobilize all actors. There are dilemmas, and there will be some choices that is hard to make. So the only way we can make it is together. We have to make sure that the choices we make does not negatively affect groups that are already vulnerable. The central transformative promise of the 2030 agenda is to leave no one behind. Not in Norway and not anywhere else. Today's webinar puts focus on sustainable urban development and the importance of how our cities are designed and used. There are important questions that is now on the agenda all over the world. In Norway, the latest talk of newspapers and social medias have been on architecture, quality housing, and of neighborhoods. We just this week the government, just this week established an advisory group to give us input on how we as politicians on the political level can contribute and facilitate the building of good neighborhoods and communities. These are important questions all over the world. The importance of bringing global goals with our local lives can probably not be overestimated. I am confident that this webinar will give future input to the discussion, and I wish you all the best for the coming hours. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I think I would also like to thank you for the very constructive and flexible and open way in which you have involved all relevant Norwegian stakeholders in producing the white paper and the action plan on the Sustainable Development Goals. That is very impressive. And of course, we are impatient. We would very much like to study your recommendations and proposals for action. I look forward to discussing this with you in due time. Finally, convey our thanks to the Minister for having again granted Habitat Norway support for our Habitat Day and Urban October activities in 2021. Thank you. Good. Let us proceed. After the welcoming session, we will now move into the more thematic interventions. And I'm very proud to invite today's keynote speaker, Suzanne M. She's with us from the UK to deliver the keynote speech. She is Associate Professor of Sociology at London School of Economics and Political Science, where she co-directs the City program. She is a well-known author of several books on city, streets, and citizens. Very recently, she published The Migrants Paradox, Street Livelihoods and Marginal Citizenship in Britain, a book with emphasis on the street, on migration, and urban inequalities. The floor is yours, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Erik, and also thank you to Habitat Norway for inviting me to participate today. And also thank you to Mette and her team for helping me with all of the vital logistics that make these transnational conversations work. Right, so what I'm going to do now is just click over to my presentation. Are we all good? Can you see that? We're good? Right. My talk today on a citizenship of the edge unfolds from the vantage points of streets in the peripheries of deindustrialized UK cities, where jobs are hard to come by and the historic underinvestment by the state are hard felt. I'd like to explore with you what it means to make life and livelihood in the context of enduring borders, increasing casualization of work and drifts to self-employment, and escalating urban rentals. This proposition then of a citizenship of the edge as a way of understanding citizenship as unsettled and the city as volatile is at the forefront of my mind since I've recently come to the end of writing and publishing this book on the Migrants Paradox. The book is located in the brutal contradictions of border-preserving politics and border expanding economics that increasingly constricts the life and the space available to the migrant. It's about the street life of these contradictions and how people go about making a life and a livelihood within a citizenship that is always called into question. Within the cracks of sovereignty and capitalism, I explore the diverse formations of street economies and how they reflect the limits and also the possibilities of migrant city making. To tell this story of the Migrants Paradox through the everyday life of the street is, I think, to write with two footings. The one footing rests on the connection of state and street and how a political economy of displacement increasingly residualizes our humanity. Here it is crucial to engage with how the asymmetries of global migration intersect with the inequalities of urban marginalization. So this prompts us to think about how do global displacements and global effects map on to urban emplacements. This overlap allows us to understand migration systems as part of the multiple processes of human displacement that unfolds across global, national, and urban space. Here we need to think about the lived connections between how citizenship is eroded by a punitive border regime and how secure work is supplanted by casualized employment and how affordable space is increasingly displaced by state-sanctioned regeneration. Together, these allow us to think about a combined political economy of displacement and to think in more related ways about the state categorization of citizens and denizens, where the denizen is constructed always as the troublesome figure, positioned outside of society, whether at the national border or at the urban outskirts. The second footing for writing the Migrants Paradox rests on relating the street to the world. This is an exploration of how diverse individuals become positioned in their work prospects and urban locality, and how they reposition themselves through claiming space. These proprietors on these streets narrate the hard work of navigating different border logics. They talk about having to learn more languages, about enrolling in more accreditations, developing additional skills, all of which grow alongside their experiences of redundancy. In my case, in my research, this includes engaging with the experiences of migrant shop proprietors in the urban margins of Birmingham, Bristol, Leicester, London, and Manchester. You can see these cities marked in the dark purple places on the map, and these indicate where migration in the UK is the most concentrated, largely as an urban phenomenon. Now, a 10-minute walk down any of the streets we engaged with in these cities evokes a dynamic configuration of how goods, services, interiors, pavements, labor, care, and contestation are imagined. Here we can think about the urban margins neither as a peripheral nor minority condition, but as a place from which to push back, to refute, and to reconfigure. Let's turn now to these streets to explore the relation between state and street and the combined processes of displacement. I'm going to show you a sequence of slides that have been very important for our research process. They essentially are made through an interdisciplinary group walking these streets, conducting face-to-face surveys with each proprietor along the street. And what you can see there is the line of connection between the proprietor shop on the street and the places where they have come from. In our survey, we asked questions about when people came to the street and also what work they did before they set up a shop. We also do ask where they're born, not because origin itself is important to us, but because of an interest in understanding the nature of the journeys and borders and the power relations at play that shape these trajectories. So that's an image then of Narborough Road in Leicester. This is an image, very similar looking image, from Rookery Road in Birmingham. Key questions when we look at these images might be, how are the long histories of colonization and political interventionism in the UK apparent in these formations of the street. So you can see very strong registers of Britain's former colonial empire, but you can also see places, particularly in the Middle East, where Britain has had a particular role in interventionist politics. This is Cheetham Hill in Manchester. And another question that might be evoked from a drawing like this is, what kinds of economies emerge through these cultural intermixtures? Does it matter that someone from Uzbekistan co-locates next to someone from Pakistan? Now, importantly here, it's necessary to comment that these are not evocations of little Chinatowns or of Chinatowns or little Italies. These are very diverse global compositions of local environments. We also want to ask what kinds of politics are possible in these street environments. What are the solidarities and everyday collaborations that emerge in relation to everyday bordering, rising rentals, and long working hours? Now, this is an image of Stapleton Road in Bristol, and this is an additional mapping that we did, which traces people's long and contorted journeys to the streets. And what we really wanted to do in this exercise was learn what it means for people to cross multiple borders to gain refuge, where they are required to speak and learn many languages, forge many skills in order to gain access to work. And I want to trace with you Harun's journey from Somalia to the street in Bristol. Now, Somalia has had a long history of civil war. So Harun left Somalia in the 1980s, and he went first to Denmark because it was an easier process of claiming asylum. Harun had trained as a teacher in Somalia, and he undertook all of his learning accreditations in order to become a fully fledged teacher. But he found, because of the structure of the labor market, that he never got a job as a fully fledged teacher. He was always employed as the teaching assistant. He then moves to the Netherlands, where he decides that he'll try and set up shop. And in the Netherlands, there are very strict procedures about entry requirements in order to enter into street trade. And so eventually, Harun leaves the Netherlands and sets up shop in Bristol. At that point, and this was pre the Conservative government coming into power, all one required to set up shop was a passport and first month of rental. What's interesting to think about here, and what we learned from some of the survey material, is that there's an incredibly wide array of origins, roots, and periods into the UK over 4 decades. Really interesting, the majority of the traders on these streets had all different forms of work experience prior to street trade. In other words, they were never street traders before they migrated. 72%, for example, of traders on Cheetham Hill had never been involved in street trade before. There were also very high occurrences of tertiary education among street traders. So, for example, again, on our street in Manchester, 78% of proprietors had a tertiary education. They had either been to college or to university. There were high occurrences of multilingual proficiencies. Almost all of the proprietors spoke 2 to 3 languages, and many spoke 4. Now, some of this is also explained by a very racialized structure of labor markets in the UK, where Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups are disproportionately represented in redundancies after the process of deindustrialization. And this was very much the case also after the 2008 financial crisis. What we're noticing now from recent labor statistics surveys is that this overrepresentation of redundancies in Black and minority ethnics is still true, but we're finding that there is a take-up in casualized forms of employment. And these are very volatile forms of employment without the correct measures of protection. Looking a little bit, and I don't want to boggle you with all of these statistics, I just want you to point you to the red arrows. If we go to the first red arrow, we survey who's employed in these businesses, approximately 66%, approximately 2/3 of employees are non-family members. Within these small shops, we're seeing generated on average 4 jobs. We're seeing very high levels of skill and expertise in setting up the shop. And we're also seeing that people were very much used to doing other forms of work. So typically, you would hear when we were doing our survey, well, 5 years ago, I was driving a bus, I was working in the post office, I was working for the local council, and then I was made redundant. How then can we begin to think about street as world? I want to take you to the interior of a Gurdwara, which is a Sikh religious building on the outskirts of Birmingham. And I want to point to you here a kind of aesthetic and cultural logic of making the city, which theorists increasingly refer to as makeshift city making. And so basically what this community does in the first instance, they arrive in Birmingham in the 1970s in order to provide their labor to the factories. And they purchase a basic house, and they use that house as their first point of spiritual footing. And over time, as this community grows, they build onto the Gurdwara. And what you can see here is a layer of building ons and add-ons and additions over a period of time. When we go into the interior of these spaces, we also learn that these religious institutions, and there are many in these streets, churches, mosques, Gurdwaras, they're very much fulfilling the role of the receding state. So austerity governance in the UK saw many local authorities lose at least 50% of their local budgets, which simply meant that the street, in terms of attending to people who were already vulnerable, already marginalized, became a really contested space. And these institutions began to run feeding schemes. And when we spoke to Rana, who was in the head committee of this Gurdwara, he said to us, we used to provide 80 meals a day to our community. Now we provide 2,000 meals a week, and we provide these meals to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Shifting across to Stapleton Road in Bristol, this is a picture of Alima. He is a young man who has made his journey from Sudan. Again, this isn't a very extended journey. It took him years to take and make the crossing, and he had to go through several European contexts in order to arrive. He's currently studying in a business degree at Coventry University, and basically a group of 3 friends have taken the rental for the shop, and they've run 3 economic and social experiments within the shop. So if we look at Zone 1, the first experiment is really around the internet and digital platforms. And it's an internet cafe, a very rudimentary kind of internet cafe, and it tells you a lot about the demographic in this area of a group of people who cannot necessarily afford computers, let alone computer contracts. In the middle of the shop, Zone 2, is a pool hall, and of course, Alima and his friends like hanging out, and this is a really fantastic social space. In Zone 3 and 4 is the coffee and the card playing. And this is where the coffee drinking and making culture from the Horn of Africa has been transposed onto a street in the south of England. And it's a really lively social sphere. What we usually found in these coffee spaces was that the telly was always on, the television was always on, usually with Al Jazeera in the background. And on the day we were doing this mapping of this shop, President Obama the former president was making his first address to the Organization of African Unity. And there were really heated political conversations that were going on in this space. So I want to think about the ordinary politics of street space as a vital resource for communities. These street transactions are compilations of diverse economies that are pragmatic and collaborative. They enroll practices of care and counsel in the context of a receding state, and they range from profit-making to profiteering to really substantial acts of care. Making space on the street allows for a redescription of surfaces, a nurturing of a citizenship of the edge that is forged rather than assigned. A citizenship of the edge is about learning how to be unsettled, perhaps the ultimate definition of a migrant, and perhaps the ultimate definition also of an urban citizen. This space is not readily available. It cannot be conferred. It has to be claimed. And so we need to think about, again, in our planning processes, much more wider accommodation for appropriation, for flexibility, for interpretation. The repertoires and solidarities formed on the street are about the difficulties and possibilities of inhabiting shared fragile realities. And here I want to really encourage all of you to think about a world of work in which more people are going to be casualized, more people are going to be working in precarious forms of self-employment. And that means that it's increasingly vital for us to think about affordable urban infrastructure in which people can make work. A citizenship of the edge suggests a different comprehension of belonging in the arrangements of crossing, encounter, and contestation. The power of these street improvisations is not to fix a system that is broken, but to rewire the circuits, repurposing and redefining a space that remains necessarily unfinished. Thank you very much to all of you for listening today.
Thank you very much, Sally, for the keynote connecting global migration with urban marginalization and exploring how race maps onto place across the globe, state, city, and street. Your contribution certainly gives direction to our further deliberations. Personally, I find that the citizenship of the edge approach is very, very adaptive and an audacious mode of belonging. And we would, from Habitat Norway side, very much like to discuss the operationalization of the concept. So we look forward to seeing you in Oslo in a not too distant future. Thank you very much. So after this keynote, inspiring keynote indeed, we will now move from the north to the south. And we will have 10 minutes sections, 10-minute interventions. So first, we are honored to have with us some leading urban theorists and activists from the South. Female leaders of grassroots movements are well represented. And we particularly would like to learn from you about the challenges you are facing, about the better and worse practices you have identified and developed. So first, relating to SDG 11.3 on participatory integrated sustainable planning and management, we will start with Sally Roever, who is the international coordinator of women in informal employment, globalizing and organizing. Sally has 20 years of experience studying the ways in which laws, policies, and politics at both local and national levels shape informal work and informal workers' organizations. Sally holds a PhD in political science from the University of California at Berkeley in 2005. She is with us from Canada. Welcome, Sally, to speak on the topic, the informal economy, challenges of people living on and from the street vendors, garbage pickers, pavement dwellers, home workers, etc. And how to partner with these groups are extremely important to learn about. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik, and thanks everyone. I'm delighted to be here and appreciate the opportunity to share with you a bit about informal employment and based, again, mainly in the Global South. And I really want to appreciate Suzanne's presentation because it's given us the backdrop, which is a world in which employment is becoming increasingly precarious. And so that's the context which I'll be speaking to, and I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully the slides will come across. Are they visible?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thanks very much. So I think in any discussion of informal employment, the common entry point is just that it's very difficult to define, it's difficult to understand, and it's difficult to measure. And so I want to offer today a different entry point that hopefully can give us a clearer picture of informal employment and how it relates to the policies that are needed to reach the SDGs. So to get there, I want to begin by introducing a few of the workers in our network, just to give us an entry point in discussions of employment conditions. So in the upper left here is Gloria Solorzano. Gloria is a street trader in Lima, Peru. She's worked selling fruits and vegetables for about 30 years. Gloria has no employer. She has no employees. Her place of work is in public space. And so what that means is that although she holds a license to sell fruits and vegetables, she could be evicted from her space at any time. So that's Gloria. In the upper right corner is Marta Elena Iglesias. Marta is a waste picker based in Rio Negro in Colombia. She also, like Gloria, has no employer, but she's a member of a cooperative of waste pickers who, on their own, collect and clean and sort recyclable materials in order to sell them to intermediaries and sort of push them up the supply chain in recycling. She also works in public space and has no guaranteed access to waste or to income. In the lower left is Siobhan Jacobs. She's a home-based worker in Cape Town, South Africa. Her place of work, unlike Gloria and Marta, her place of work is her own home. She also has no employer and she has no written contracts, but she essentially takes orders from local and global producers for her work as a seamstress. And she has little or no control over the prices at which she sells the goods that she makes. And then in the lower right corner is Myrtle Witboy. She's worked as a domestic worker starting in 1966 in Johannesburg in South Africa. Her place of work, unlike the others, is her employer's home. And when she started out also, she had no contract and really no leverage over her working conditions. So what this group has in common is that it kind of tells us what it means to be a worker in informal employment from their point of view, which means as individual people, as individuals, they have very little power and very little control over their working conditions. They have little to no access to productive resources that are provided by the state, exposure to risk. So with that in mind, how many people in the world have this form of employment in common, and how can the informal economy be measured, and how many informal workers are there in the world? Well, the International Labor Organization, through the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, has developed a conceptual framework to help us answer those questions. The conceptual framework essentially says there are two dimensions of informality. So one is an enterprise dimension, which is essentially unincorporated enterprises that are not constituted as separate legal entities independently of their owners. And then there's an employment dimension, which is jobs that are not subject to national labor legislation, income taxation, social protection, or entitlement to the types of standard employment benefits that we see in informal employment, in formal employment. And the important point here is that informal jobs can be found in informal sector enterprises, but they can also be found in formal sector enterprises, for example, where workers don't have contracts, and they can also be found in households, as in the case of Myrtle and other domestic workers. So the informal economy, from the standpoint of an international statistical definition, it consists of all units, activities, and workers in the informal sector, in informal enterprises, and in informal employment. So with this conceptual framework in mind, then, how many are there? Well, the ILO in 2018 published the first ever global estimates of informal employment using a common framework for measurement in labor force surveys. And they found that 61% of all employment in the world is informal. So that's over 2 billion workers in the world share this condition of informal employment. And of course, there's differences across income levels in countries. So in developing countries, 90% of all employment is informal. And you can see in the regional breakdown, the rates of informal employment are higher in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southern Asia, and in East and Southeast Asia as compared to other regions. So why that's important is that you can imagine in developing countries, one of the challenges is most households don't have a single worker in them who have access to social protections and labor protections, such as health insurance through their employer, such as a pension through their employer. There's no one in the household who has those protections. So again, the level of risk is extremely high, and as we've seen over the past year and a half, even higher in crisis circumstances. So the question then is, how do workers in this situation overcome the poor working conditions they face as individuals? I wanted to talk a little bit about how some of the worker leaders that we met in the first slide have began mobilizing. And essentially what they have in common is that they've all said mobilizing starts at the grassroots level with a new vision of workers and the role they play in society. So Gloria, for example, her organization is Renata. It's the National Network of Self-Employed Workers. And 20 years ago or so, she saw that most street vendors in Lima were women, but all leaders of street vendor organizations were men. And so she formed a network of women workers to try to get into leadership positions in their organizations, and eventually grew that into a national organization of self-employed workers that includes street traders, but others. So it was a change in conception of what's needed. Marta similarly saw that waste pickers, when she formed her cooperative about 20 years ago called Planeta Verde, she saw that waste pickers didn't really have a view of their own work as anything more than a way to survive. Yet they provide an environmental service to the city by diverting waste from landfills. So she and others formed this cooperative to pool their labor and sort of build a collective path forward, and again has grown and affiliated to movements at higher levels. Myrtle similarly saw her as a domestic worker. Domestic workers were absolutely invisible in society, poorly treated with no rights. And so she formed what eventually became SADSAWU, which is a South African domestic workers union. So these organizations then, growing up from this vision of this change in vision, really, of seeing the need to organize, has then seen the need also for organizations to come together into regional and global networks, because they also recognize that one organization on its own can't change global policies that kind of shape the opportunities. And so these organizations have worked together to get to scale as membership-based organizations at national, regional, and global levels, including StreetNet International, which is a global alliance of street vendors, the Global Alliance of Waste Pickers, HomeNet International, just launched this year after years and years of network building, and the International Domestic Workers Federation. So having sort of built organizations, changed the vision, and scaled up, then how do they actually influence policy, and what are the structures? Well, Essentially, what WIEGO does is it plays a bridging role between three constituencies, which are membership-based organizations of informal workers, such as the ones that you've seen on the previous page, researchers, statisticians, and development practitioners, and also to serve as a bridge between this kind of everyday grounded reality of what is it like to be in informal employment and to face the amount of intersecting risks and the mainstream policy debates in order to influence the global agenda. So we do this through a combination of research, capacity building, and policy advocacy, which are all necessary in order to get the voices of workers into global agenda setting forums. I'm just given a few examples here. The International Labor Conference is one, which in fact is going on just now over the next 2 weeks. So we will always have, for many years, had a presence at the International Labor Conference as a global movement of informal workers. This year, the focus is on social protection, and our members have developed a platform on how to extend social protection to informal workers to raise the profile of that 2 billion workers, those 2 billion workers who are out of social protection. The International Conference of Labor Statisticians, which has made it possible to even know how many there are. World Urban Forums, Habitat 3, the current Generation Equality Forum from UN Women. These are the types of global agenda setting forums. And basically, the way to open that up is to have the organizations and their leaders come together with research, capacity building, and policy advocacy alongside partnerships with other civil society organizations, the formal sector unions, universities, research centers, and so on. And so essentially what the model, what we see to be necessary to actually influence the content of international norms is this combination of, on the one hand, kind of deep connection with the lived reality that workers like Marta Elena face every single day, and the global mainstream debates, and sort of shifting the focus to the lived reality of informal workers and creating platforms for them to have a voice. So, as Marta says, previously we kept to ourselves, my street, my cardboard, my glass, and sort of didn't care much about everyone else, but eventually realized that they had to fight and come together, be united as a group, and then link up to other groups from other places. And that work then carries through forums like the International Labor Conference in Geneva. So this is a photo of Marta speaking on the floor, and goes through the influencing the content of international norms, which can then be carried back down to national and local level and implementation. So I hope that offers a little bit of a different window into informal employment, and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sally. The work of WIEGO is really impressive, and I'm particularly impressed by the way you advocate, or first you assist marginalized groups to define their policies and their issues, and how you lift these issues not only on the local level but also on the national and on the global level. And I would like to congratulate you on the achievements you have made within the international labor organizations on behalf of people in the informal economy. So I think also what is important is the partnership you have with researchers who are members of WIEGO, that also contributes to greater consciousness and clarification about the context that informal workers are living and working in. So this is, in a way, for me, some kind of stuff that dreams are made of. We certainly would like to have WIEGO also in Norway. The informal economy, the gig economy, is also very much on the offensive in in a country, social democratic country like Norway. So thank you very much again. Then I would just like to remind the audience that you can ask questions on our Habitat Norway at gmail.com address. I hope our technical advisor has everything under control with regard to these questions, Johannes. Then, our next thematic focus will relate to SDG 11.7 on public spaces. We have two speakers on this topic, which is the street, safety and security for women and girls, how to include them and how to make them feel safe. So I'm very proud to introduce to you a good friend and colleague, Anna Falu, an Argentinian architect and a social activist for human rights and for women's rights. She's a researcher and professor at the National University of Cordoba, where she's a director of Housing and Habitat Research Institute. She is chair of UN Habitat's advisory group of gender initiatives, where I have the honor to be vice chair. The floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you very much, Erik. This is an honor for me, for this invitation, and to be part of this very important debate. Thanks to Habitat Norway for this invitation and for the extraordinary work you are doing. Thank you very much, Erik, for this invitation. I've been hearing very carefully my colleagues and the people that was contributing here, and really all of them open doors for the reflection on the cities and on the streets and the public spaces. I will address my contribution from the LAC region. I'm going to upload a presentation. Hope this is, let's see. Can you see it? Hello? Okay.
Yes, we can see
Hope
it.
you can see it. Thank you very much. So I was saying that I'm going to present these reflections from Latin America, the most unequal region in the world. And I will focus in the frame of these inequalities Latin America and the Caribbean regions are living, the omission of women in this urban planning and in the thinking of the city. Who are cities for? But as CISCSA said, streets and public spaces are the places where those that do not have voices can find their voices and achieve their power. Latin American streets and public spaces are also uncontradictory the places of power of those without voices. The global street is a concept, in fact, that is in our stories and in our experiences, yeah? And it has different and specific forms as appropriated. And I would say that the streets, the urban street, these public spaces must be differentiated, as Saskia elaborates, from the ritual notion of the public activities of the European cities. From the Women's in Latin America and from the Women Articulations and Network, we have been working since 1986 in these public spaces and violences against women. And my focus will be on that, from a gender perspective and from the women's demand, including the accessibility, the services, and the use of public spaces, the time and the space, how it matters for women's life. And we learned that life in cities, both for men and women, is related to the experiences they have in their life. And those social relations of gender are also expressed in the conformation of the urban space and reproduce these relations. The global street is different and unequal, and it will depend on which context, how it is situated, the analysis we are going to make. Also, in the analysis of the streets and the public spaces, we need to account the symbolic meaning of the spaces. Because as Doreen Massey taught us in the 90s, this meaning of spaces is related, straight related to the exclusion and to the violence and to the fear, and how spaces and places are not considered themselves from a gender perspective. So it affects the ways in which gender is constructed and understood. The places and the spaces, and particularly vis-a-vis this COVID-19 pandemic, are changing, and they are also the audience, they are the stage for the public. The streets, the full streets of the Latin American pedestrian cities now are empty, and new uses are appearing, new dynamics, new uses, new ways of appropriate, and new expression on how to use. But women, despite all the progresses, still suffer unequal and discriminatory treatment by a set of driving rules, by a set of stereotypes, cultures, traditions, values that are granted by the different societies according to their traditions and culture, just for the fact of being women. Thus, women are subordinated, and there is an exercise of power by one sex over the other, mainly men over women. But women are not all equal. There are differences among women that run along ethnic, racial, and class lines, all worthy of public attention. And what we learn in Latin America, in the diversity of Latin America, is that when we analyze from the intersection of racism and sexism, it produces different forms of subordination in the Black and in the indigenous women in Latin America, what we call the double discrimination. Therefore, we think that there is a need of building a new episteme that challenge this construction that is basically the construction of the patriarchal society. And this construction is based in the omission of women. It's a conception that undervalues women, not just women, but mainly women. The question to question urban planning from this neutral approach that is not neutral, but is omission. And when we think about any one of the social subjects in the streets and in the public spaces, we are usually omitting women and putting women inside the neutrality of those subjects. That's why I appreciate so much the presentation of Sally from WIEGO that put such a strong emphasis on women in the streets and women in the so-called informal market. In the spaces and in and in the streets and in the public spaces, there is a war of places, as Raquel Rodnik is saying, elaborating in her book. And in the streets and the public spaces, there is a war. These are images of the kids in the streets with the new technology they hardly can afford. So this is the study of one of the doctorandus I directed in the Institute of Housing at the National University. And this is the normal picture of any city in Latin America. The boundaries, the urban boundaries that will really express the differences of the spaces where people is living. So the city and its places, its spaces, are that material support of the society life. And it expresses the complex universe of the social and economic and cultural relationship. We have to say that since childhood, our boys, our men, the one that take the use of the public space, and that women are built in the fear of that public space. So cities, in their way of thinking those public spaces, are reproducing those conditions. We have been doing studies in Argentina, and I'm going to share with you only two questions. One question was regarding how do you feel secure in the streets and the public spaces? And close to 45% are saying insecure. Nearly 31% very insecure. So this is giving around above 75% of women that are saying they feel insecure in the streets and in the public spaces. And when you go to the ages of those women, we don't have the time now, you will see that the insecurity is most in the most young women than in the elderly women. When we ask them if they modify any route or any way of displacement in the city to feel more secure, 71% of them are saying yes. And if you go to the age, you will see that the young women feel more insecure in the street than the elderly. We are working in a participatory method to highlight, and we are working in 4 cities at this very moment in research, and working with to highlight the problems women experience in the cities, in the public spaces, and in which spaces of the city. There is a lot to share about this, but the red one is the spots where they feel very insecure in the city. So in this context of the social construction of this insecurity, there is an abandonment of the street and the public spaces. And in this retreat into the spaces, it generates more insecurity. So fear provokes abandonment of streets and public spaces, and in return, these empty spaces feed the fear. This is a condition, and this is a condition that is based on the physical, the material conditions of our streets, our city, because we have as many streets and spaces and public spaces as social conditions. But women are organizing, of course, as Sally expressed, for the informal market. Multiple strategies of women to overcome fear in Brazil, in Argentina, in every country of the world. But I want to go to some principles, and with this I will try to finish, some principles that were written in 2002 by Anne Michaud in Montreal, in the Montreal experience. And it's impressive how actual they are for the cities, streets, and public spaces and the fragmented city of our Latin America urban agglomerations. So Anne Michaud elaborated this, to know where you are and where you are going. And this is signposting, strategically located, easy to be read, easy to understood. The second is to see and be seen. So the visibility, having certain control of the space, the lighting. Sometimes the lighting of a street will make the difference, as women in the popular neighborhoods of Cordoba, Argentina are saying. Or bushes that we need to control, or vacant lots that needs to be rehabilitated or recuperated. To hear and be heard, the presence of people, the vitality of the places, to be able to escape. And this is very important. And now there are a lot of new instruments with the applications for mobile phone, for the SOS buttons in the bus stops or in the corner of the streets. So there are ways to do that, yeah, to assure that people, women particularly, is able to escape and also to request for help. To live in a clean and friendly environment, this is central, because the space that needs to be fostered in the conditions, and to be fostered by the community particularly, and to be used and not to be feared. Yeah. So these are aspects that are very important and should be contemplated, and regards the maintenance of the streets and the public spaces. And this is not very usual in the poor neighborhoods. And 6, the community participation. This is central, because it's only in these linkages, in this capacity of women to act all together and to be attentive one to the other, that they can really build these safety strategies. So what we are saying from the feminist urbanism, we are saying that it is central to put inequality in the urban agenda, the social inclusion for the urban agenda, for these streets that matter, for these cities and public spaces that should matter to all, and the inclusion of the omitted, women and the diversity, all the LGBTQ population. To consider the urban attribute of proximity, and in this sense, the neighborhood at the center of the policies, because the neighborhood is where the everyday life takes place, the security, the vitality of the public spaces, the open street, this new concept that is a concept that exactly is questioning the car use, and is questioning the lack of observance on the environmental conditions and the climate change. How people can come back to the street more for the pedestrian than for the car. The accessibility, the participation, the voices of women to hear their priorities, and of course, the environmental condition. I'm going to show you some slides to just to give a view of what I'm talking about, and to consider this. This is the open street. This is fantastic, because these are the new
Anna, I think we are running out of time. So I'm afraid I have to continue and give the floor to the next speaker.
Okay.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. We are much inspired by what you have talked about. And I think particularly the principles for safe streets are very relevant also in the Norwegian context. So thank you very much, Anna. Now we have to move on. So under the same topic, we move from Cordoba, Argentine, to Oslo, where we have with us Eva Storhusten. She has recently graduated as a civil architect and is now professional advisor at the National Association of Norwegian Architects. Presently in leave with a newborn baby. I welcome the two of you, Eva, from home to give us a better practice, a case from Zanzibar city, a result of your master study. The floor is yours.
Islamic tradition. Here is an aerial photo of Old Stone Town and the area of focus I've been working on in a black rectangle. And as you can see here, it has a very dense urban fabric. It has a very active streetscape with shops on street level, residential on upper floors. And as it has been a center for trade, the culture and architecture has influences from Africa, the Arab region, India, and Europe. And there are very few car streets cutting the old urban fabric, which makes it pedestrian friendly, and it's a very lively place. Here's just a model showing the urban density, and the image to the right is the negative image of the model. So it shows the streetscape and the roofscape. It gives maybe an idea of this. In the research phase, I was in dialogue with various organizations and stakeholders, which you can see listed here. And especially one organization became key in my research development. Reclaim Women's Space is a local organization for women and civil society, promoting awareness of the lost women's spaces in this context. In addition to organizing meetings, I also interviewed local women of different ages and socioeconomic backgrounds to understand how everyday life unfolds as a woman in Old Stone Town. To the right is Mrs. Saidi. She's the leader of the organization. And this is Maida, a representative from the younger generation of women who informed my research. Many points could be made from reflections and meetings I had. However, my main observation is that the understanding of their own position, agency, and space vary a lot depending on education, socioeconomic backgrounds, and civil status. So as many of you probably already know, in traditional Muslim culture, men and women have had separate spaces to socialize outside the home. This diagram shows that many of the public spaces for women have disappeared, while the public spaces for men continue to exist. I do not wish to put an emphasis on this division, but rather explore the dynamics of how the women's public spaces could relate to the wide public, and as you can see on this diagram. I won't go into detail of this, but this is a map of some of the lost women's spaces in this context. And the reason why the previous women's spaces have disappeared is complex, yet it's possible to make one clear observation. And that is when Zanzibar was discovered as a popular tourist destination, commercialization of space put pressure on the urban fabric and resulted in the loss of these previously allocated women's spaces. And here is an article that was published in The Guardian in 2018. Tourism pushed women out of Zanzibar's public spaces, but now they're taking them back. In this article, members from Reclaim Women's Space are interviewed, the same organization that became key in my research. And now we're zooming into the site, which you can see here in the white circle, and a hand-drawn site plan. Here we go down to the streets, an image of the street life. So as you can see, there are several, or at least in this picture, one pop-up street food kiosk, and yet there's no formal programming. And in this plot, there was a house previously that deteriorated after the revolution in Zanzibar. So many things could be said, but I'm keeping it short. At nighttime, a group of men who consume alcohol and marijuana occupies the space, and Horumsi Square is therefore often associated with drugs, which makes women and children stay away, especially after sunset. So, how to deal with this? An important experience for the program on the site was a pop-up outdoor cinema screening with local films. It was initiated by me as a part of the research and carried out in collaboration with local partners. During the event, the site changed from being occupied mainly by men to being full of playful children and their parents. So this experience proved to me the potential of a neighborhood film and cultural site. As a part of the process, I interpreted the research into a room program focusing on cultural activities for women and the community. Through my fieldwork, it is my assessment that clearly defined privacy layers are key to designing safe, inclusive spaces for women and children in this context. In this way, part of the square is still open for everybody, which you can see here in light pink, while other parts of the structure can be closed for events and workshops targeted to empower women and children. And this principle, I believe, is relevant for other contexts, whether it's in Africa, Asia, Europe, or elsewhere, although I believe form and function would depend on contextual variables. Here's a model image showing the project, architectural project in its context. The grand plan, which is public, is intended to be run by the organization Reclaim Women's Space. And in order to make it a safe place at nighttime, the square would be lit up in certain points and have a nighttime guard so that everybody can still use the space, but it's more accommodated to make local women feel safe. And this is a grand plan showing its connection to the street. The design has a flexible structure that allows multifunctional use. This is the structure here. There are pivot doors in the ground floor that can be opened or closed, depending on the privacy required to host events for women. There is a fountain and a small rainwater collection, and bougainvillea and small spice garden here. Here's a model image showing the pivot doors, allowing visibility to the street, which is very important, as my previous speaker was mentioning. This section cuts through the atrium and shows here the small community stage, which can be used for music performances, outdoor film screenings, or entrepreneurial business activities for women. And here are some model images showing fragments of the architectural details. So this project is a combination of an actual site and its challenges, yet it's also my interpretation and exploration of what a revived women's space could be in this context. So the project is inspired by the women and men I met during my research, yet it also includes my Norwegian understanding of social, cultural equality in a public space, materiality and architecture. So lastly, there are challenges related to women's experience of security in public spaces, both in Norway and other countries. And we know that the UN Sustainability Goal 11.7 states that by 2030, we will ensure that everybody, especially women and children, the elderly and people with disabilities, has access to safe, inclusive and accessible green areas and public spaces. So in order to create a strategy that can meet the UN Sustainability Goal 11.7, we do not only need knowledge about physical elements that create safety and inclusion, we also need to understand the social norms of a particular culture. It is therefore necessary to conduct socio-cultural site analysis, including qualitative interviews of women and children to capture underlying challenges in any given context. This method is a strategic move, and while the design principles, including the layered spaces that I mentioned, must be adapted to the specific context. So if you have questions or want to discuss these ideas for a different context, please do not hesitate to contact me. You'll find me on LinkedIn, or you get the information through Erik. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eva and Anna, for both analysis, but also a very interesting better practice case on how to meet on the street level the safety and security challenges of women and young girls. The approaches, I think, as pointed out, will vary very much from different socio-cultural, economic context. But still, it's a very important discussion to pursue, particularly in a situation where we have a present pandemic. We have an emerging financial crisis. We have food shortages. We have floods. We have fever. And we have floods. We really need to sharpen up our discussion. So, and we will do that in the next part. We move on to the next topic, which relates particularly to SDG 11.3, participatory, integrated, sustainable planning and management, where we also have two speakers. First, we hopefully have with us from Beijing, China, Celine Cruz. She is presently affiliated with the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and also board member for the Block by Block Foundation, which supports UN Habitat on their public space agenda. She is a founding member of Slum Dwellers International, with long experience from grassroots movements in Asia, for instance, the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights. Take it on, Celine.
Thank you, Erik. I'm already having a problem showing my presentation. I will need help quickly. Are you able to? Focus on the women who live on the streets of Mumbai and how they built their capacities and supported other women in other communities and other slums in the city, and moved on to create a movement of slum dwellers in many cities in India, and then took it to many other cities in Asia and Africa. And in 1996, out of these processes that started in Mumbai by these women pavement dwellers, was created Slum Dwellers International. And this is a celebration of all the capacities that these women have built over the years and what they bring to the table when they negotiate with their local governments and national governments for housing, water, basic services, slum upgrading. And I will walk you through these slides, and they're basically lots of pictures, and I'll just tell you short stories because you've had lots of experts talk about the issue of streets and urban planning. Next, please. So here is a picture for those of you who've never been to a slum. You have all kinds of slums in South Asia. You have them along the railway tracks, in low-lying areas along the terrain of the hillsides, near garbage dumps, along railway tracks, even on rooftops. Like in Cambodia, you have them on rooftops, and on all kinds of lands. And they live in precarious conditions. They find the most difficult places to live in because they hope that they'll be invisible and the city will not see them and they won't be demolished. Next, please. So these are the informal workers who like Sally said, 60, 70, 80% of the city in the global south live in informal settlements and work in the informal sector, and they do all kinds of jobs, from street vendors to domestic servants to head loaders to working in the construction industry, in the informal markets. And so they're not like what most people think, in doing nothing and just sitting at home. They're all gainfully employed and earning a salary and contributing to the city's economy. And this is extremely important to understand, that they're all contributing to the city's economy. Next, please. And what is the government's response to most of these solutions? So basically the government, the most common response in the 80s and 90s was evictions. Now the government has become more sophisticated on how they do evictions. They do it very invisibly. They, like in Uganda, Kampala, they'll break about, a few houses here and a few houses there. So it's not like a huge eviction, but they make them disappear, give them money overnight, and these families have to go and fend for themselves. So you continue to have evictions in a different way, but that is one of the solutions governments have found when they want to push their agenda for urban development. Another solution that is common is, you see on the right-hand side, is the public housing solution, where they keep building these ugly matchbox houses and people are shoved into these houses. But with the deficit of houses that need to be constructed in the city, they are really unable to continue to build such buildings because they're never going to be able to reach that deficit. For example, in Mumbai, about 6 million people live in the slums of the city, and the government is going to take them another 25 or 30 years if they have to house them all. So it's impossible. So they have to think of other kinds of solutions, but there's a roadblock there. The other solution that they find is slum upgrading. In the slum upgrading solution, it's like putting makeup. They'll put a tap there and a toilet there and a pathway here, which all deteriorates and disintegrates in a couple of months or years, and people have to start from scratch again. So it's not a permanent solution, but it's a very ad hoc, short-term, temporary solution, and it makes them feel that they do something, but it's not a long-term solution. And in fact, many times, this kind of ad hoc projects, infrastructure projects, can create more difficulties for the city's infrastructure and flooding and building resilience. And nobody thinks of these kind of problems. The city doesn't think of it, NGOs don't think of it, but people have to live. And so they continue to make do with whatever resources and whatever permissions they get to improve the quality of their life. And of course, in the last picture, you see governments just do what they want to do. And if they don't want to do anything, they ignore you and they look the other way. Next, please. So here is a picture of pavement dwellers living on the streets of Bombay. You have about 30,000 families living on the streets of Bombay. A lot of them now have been resettled, but you still have many families continuing to live there. But why do they live on the streets? Because the slums are overfull. There is no place in any other piece of land in the city. So people started squatting on the streets. And this is pictures from the 80s. So they came into the city, there was no land, they lived on the streets, and they lived next to their place of work. So all of them worked in the wholesale markets in the center of the city. The women worked as domestic servants in the buildings nearby. And the reason they worked so close by was because when there was a demolition, they had to come running down from the buildings to protect their houses and protect their belongings. And very often they lost it all and had to start from scratch and build that little shack again. On the right-hand side is a similar situation, and you wouldn't know which city, right? The right-hand side is Manila, Philippines, a house along the railway tracks. It could look like Mumbai, it could look like Thailand, it could look like any other city in South Asia and East Asia. Next slide, please. So the women who are completely hopeless and illiterate and didn't have any solutions started finding their own solutions and did not want to wait for government. And what was their solution? They started their savings and they started collecting information. And they realized these are two things that the rich have that the poor don't have. So if they were able to put their money together, they realized their ability to negotiate with external actors, including local government, was much better because they didn't look like paupers and useless and, these poor things, but they went to the table with their savings and their money, and they were able to, show the banks that they had this money and they were capable of taking a loan. So the little money, which was very small, and they, most of them were daily wage earners or they earn on a weekly basis. But when you put their money together and aggregated it together, it made them feel powerful, it made them feel empowered, and they were able to use that to leverage loans for upgrading and housing. The next slide, please. So like they collected money to collect people, they collected information, and in this way they collected communities and people as well. And this was information that the city did not have. So the city never understood the nuances of the slums in the city of Mumbai. So for example, when the community started counting and mapping, and they started realizing that there were different pockets in the city based on land ownership. So there were people who lived, about 85,000 families lived along the railway tracks. About 65,000 families lived in the middle of the city in this big slum called Dharavi. About 90,000 families lived along the airport lands, in the airports, and they call themselves the airport slums. So the leader of the Slum Dwellers Federation, Jokin, actually started organizing these communities based on their land ownership. So you took a huge problem and you broke them into small parts, and that was so much easier to begin to negotiate because each of those landowners you had to begin to negotiate with that land owning authority. So if you lived on the railway land, you basically negotiated with the railway authorities. With the airport lands, you negotiated with the airport authorities. On municipal land, you negotiated with the municipal authority. So the organization was created around the land ownership. Next, please. So here you have more homework. So this was all, so basically you don't leave a page unturned, right? So the women worked out all kinds of ways to be able to put their aspirations and their dreams through little house models, to designs, to settlement designs, to be able to send a message to the city that they were poor, they were illiterate, but it didn't mean that they didn't have the brains to plan their house and plan their future. And they were able to sit and make these kind of rough maps, which later on, next please, which they translated into life-size house models like this, because they realized the architects make those little baby houses and nobody understands the ratios and nobody understands how big and small they are. So they actually built large, full-size models with bamboo and cloth. And these are exhibitions that happened all over Africa, in Asia. The one on the top right-hand side was done at the UN building in New York, where Kofi Annan came and inaugurated that. But the whole idea was for women to walk into that space, take their bedding, take their little kitchenette, take their bed, and get a sense of how much space there was and whether, you know, if a family of 8, what did they have to do to improve the design of the house so they could accommodate more members in the family. So for example, in Bombay, they took their pavement house on the streets, which was very tiny, 10 by 4, but they all had a little mezzanine. So when they were designing their new house, they actually increased the height of the house to 14 feet height, built a mezzanine inside. So in that way, you had the children sleeping up, you had the adults sleeping down, and you had a little bunk outside the house where the old people slept. So they found a way to accommodate the whole family without asking for more land. Next, please. So here on the left-hand side, the same women living on the streets of Mumbai who basically brought me up, that is the building that they developed and they supervised and they constructed for themselves. So it's basically, though it looks 7-storied because that's the only kind of land that they had, and they had to go high-rise because the government was not going to give them more land, but they did the same thing. They took the pavement design, made 14-feet houses in that same building. So all of them were able to accommodate their larger families of 7, 8, 9, 10 members. On the right-hand side were the houses after the tsunami in Sri Lanka in 2004, when they were all washed away. The communities were frightened that they were going to lose their land. So as soon as the tsunami passed away, and before the government started making laws about people not being able to go back to their land, and this frightened the people. So what they just started building. And that is the difference between Asian communities and communities in the north. Nobody is waiting for permissions from government. You start constructing. And the whole logic is the other way around, because if you wait for government, it's not going to happen. Next slide, please. This is another example of Mumbai. On the left-hand side, you see a clear track. On the right-hand side, you see all the slums sprawling and really spilling onto the tracks. And this was a huge project, the Mumbai Urban Transport Project. And the Federation resettled around 40,000 families from along the railway tracks to alternative pieces of land, which were 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers and not very far away from the existing piece of land. But the reason they were able to do it is because they were organized, They were very clear of the alternative solution, and they were able to negotiate that with the railway authorities. Next, please. This is Nairobi. In Nairobi, on the right-hand side, you'll see the new construction, low-rise, high density. You don't have to spend a lot on foundation. It's very possible for communities to maintain these kind of structures when they are high-rise. If there's a plumbing issue, if there is any leakage, you need more sophisticated maintenance. You need engineers, you need external people to come in to support you. But these kind of small, low-rise, high-density structures is completely possible for communities to repair them, to maintain them. It's not an issue. You don't need a lift. It's cost beneficial. You don't need lots of money to basically develop that land. So these were all the benefits that communities began to see of going low-rise. But it's so difficult to put this across to local governments who all want to maximize the land that they have and want people to go high-rise. And all these high-rises, as we've seen, and you all have that experience, that in 10 years, they become like slums. And it's worse off than living on a piece of land. Next, please. So this is an example in Thailand where the government, the Ministry of Housing, actually put millions of dollars to actually create this community development fund. And for the first time, they made a decision of finding an institutional mechanism where the money was given right down to the local community groups to be able to make their own decisions and prioritize which projects that they were going to take on. And so communities were organized, they got their act together, they sat together as committees, they sat with their local governments, they prioritized which projects would be phased out and who would get it first, second, third. And it just took away all the headache from the government. And this is so simple. So when communities actually are able to build their capacity to reach this level of negotiation, it's very easy for government to actually share their headaches with communities, and they don't need to carry all that headache. The next one, please. Okay, great. So it's done. Have I kept my time?
Thank you very much, Celine. You have certainly visualized and also opened our minds to both the situation, but also the importance and innovativeness of grassroots movements. There is a need to strengthen them, to mobilize resources locally, nationally, and globally. And I think it will be a priority for Habitat Norway in the years to come to try to encourage the Norwegian government to support the emerging representative grassroots movements of the world. So we will now move on from Beijing, China, to Karachi, Pakistan, to the second speaker under this topic, presenting us with a case with a better practice that has and is improving the lives of millions of people. In Orangi, we find Asia's biggest informal settlement, and we find the Orangi pilot project that still, after almost 40 years, is a pilot project, which says a lot about their creativeness. I'm honored to have with me Akilah Ismail. She's now the chair of Orangi Pilot Project and also the inspiration and the force behind the Justice for Perveen campaign following the tragic murder of her sister Perveen in 2013. She has written extensively on women's issues as well as the development concerns of Karachi from the lane and up. The floor is yours, Akilah.
Yeah. You know, the topic that you have chosen it's from this the streets. And that is exactly what Orangi Pilot Project is. And it came about through many, many, many months of just roaming around the settlement of Orangi, which at that time had 0.8 million people. And these were mostly immigrants who came in from Bangladesh and upcountry, etc. Very, very poor, and the government had no plans for them. There was no housing. They were just asked to go into the boonies and make their own houses and make their own lives. So the Orangi Pilot Project was set up in 1980. And it took 2 years of simply just walking around and looking around and talking to the people, which made them decide, okay, this is the manner in which they are going to approach development. And the manner in which they were going to approach is to ask the people, to dialogue with the people and ask them what they needed and to show them what was possible. And in order to be able to show them what was possible, it was very necessary that models be created. And by models, we mean technical models. For example, what was very early on apparent is that the first thing that needed to be done was the street had to be cleaned. The lanes had to be cleaned, because without hygiene, without disposal of sewage, etc., there was such huge health concerns. The economic activity was completely stunted. Children were not going to school. There were no schools practically. So the first thing that needed to be done was to lay a system whereby the streets and the lanes would be clean. And the government was not going to do it. So what transpired was that after intensive dialogue and extensive dialogue, it was talking to the people, and Orangi Pilot Project realized, Parveen was one of the leading members at that time. They realized that the only way in which a proper development activity could take place is when the people own it. Now, how are the people going to own it? The people are going to own it when they realize that they have the power to change the lane. And once they change the lane, they go beyond, they change the community, they link up with the city, etc. And in order to change the lane, they also have to be willing to invest not just their own money, but also their time and their skills. So what the Orangi Pilot Project did was it first of all created a low-cost sanitation model. It was low cost, so which meant economically it was viable. It was very simple, and it was so simple that the people in the lanes with minimal training, for example, and also by minimally training the skilled artisans around, it could be carried out, it could be operational. Now, after the model was created, it took 6 months to organize the first street or the first lane, which meant that you organize them in order to collect the money. And Orangi Pilot Project made it very clear that, look, we are not going to take the money, we are not going to give you money. It's your money, you look after it. And this is the way in which you spend. This is the design. We will help you carry out this design, which means that you connect from the internal meaning the latrine, the disposal in the lane, the pipes, etc. And the whole concept was that it should work through gravity, and there was no need for power because there was no electric power at that time in those places. So when they organized, and I must tell you that the first lane manager, we call them the lane manager. A lane is a unit of organization, which is a street on which about 20 houses are constructed, and it contains, each house contains about 7 individuals. So 140 people gathering together. And they needed to elect a leader, they needed to elect a manager, and then through continuous dialogue and through mostly telling the women of the households, okay, look, this is something you can do. If you wait for the government, you'll wait forever. Now do this. And the first lane manager was a very strong woman who said, okay, we are the ones who suffer the most. When the children are sick, when there is no money coming in because of a lack of economic activity, there's no education, and especially whatever little education was available was not available to the girls, to their daughters. So what started off with the first lane then became 2, 3, 4, and now there are 7,000 lanes in Orangi where this model has been carried out by the people themselves. And we call this an internal component of development of the sanitation model, because it's an internal component, because the sewage has to go from the lane to a bigger secondary and then go to bigger drains and then be treated and then be finally disposed. And in the case of Karachi, it is disposed into the sea. Now, where they could make the smaller components, it was impossible to make the bigger components. But that means this component needed to be connected to the council level, to the first of all the community level, the council level, and then the city level work. So in that case, again, OPP began dialoguing with the government and with the people's representatives. Okay, look, the people have invested, they have done their part. Now you do your part. And then the government was very happy to do it, because a major part of the investment had already been done. It's the lanes and the streets that require the major investment. So they very readily made the arrangements for the secondaries and the bigger pipes and the final treatment and the disposal. So therefore, what happened was, and in this case, the dialoguing was not done by OPP. The dialoguing was done by the people themselves, with OPP supporting them. OPP had given them a model, and in essence, what happened was that OPP and the people together made it possible to get a seat at the table of negotiation of where government money is to be spent. And therefore, you had the internal component and you had the external component. We called this the component sharing, where the people did the internal component and the government then did the external component. And therefore, in our opinion, the perfect people-government partnership was developed. The people-government partnership meant that the people, instead of asking international financial organizations or the World Bank or whatever, corporations to come and lay a gutter line or to lay a lane, they said, you partner with the people. The people will invest what they can, and when you assure them that you will do the rest. And the people were told that when you do this, the government is bound to help you. So this way, it has spread, and now OPP, because it was so people-driven, OPP does not have to intervene only technically they intervene. Right? And then the community asks us. So what was born is the people-government partnership, and they took it from the lane to the city. So what happened is that people from, visitors, relatives, etc., would come and visit, and they would see that the lane is completely clean. And when a lane is clean, when a street is clean, it means economic activity goes forth, the health, the expenses on the health goes down, and children play in the streets. Children are able to go to school, and because money is saved, girls can go to school. So what has started in 1982 as a settlement, as an informal settlement of 0.8 million people, today is a thriving township of 2.1 million people. And they have schools, they have clinics, they have everything. And the genesis was the fact that the people took it upon themselves to do certain components of development, and therefore compel the government to do their part. Now OPP works not only in Karachi, not only in Orangi, it works all over Pakistan in all the informal settlements. We call them Kachiyabadis. And the reason that I am only relying on talking is this. That is the basis. You dialogue with the people, you create the conditions, you teach them to understand what is development, what is it they need, and what is possible. So from this possibility, and now we have, in Pakistan, we were making an estimate the other day, and I think we have reached about 7 million people directly with our model and with our ethos. The ethos is, you first talk to the people, understand what they need, see what they are doing to overcome their own issues, and then teach them to do it better. So it is always first you understand, you learn, you understand, and then you teach. Never impose. We never impose our solutions on them. The solution comes from the people themselves. What we do is we support them technically, we support them in organizing, in mobilizing, and it has been very rewarding experience. And now what we do is we train people. We train people to look at development in their own areas. And how do we train them to look at development? We teach them to make community-based maps. We teach them to look at your area, look at it with an eye, okay, what is it you already have and what is it you lack? And therefore, decide what is it you really want. Do you think water is your main issue? Do you think sanitation is your main issue? And invariably, it turns out it's water and sanitation first of all. And in this manner, you know, we are taking care of health. We're taking care of education. We are also taking care of the environment, because a clean environment is the first. A clean environment necessarily needs disposal. And disposal of waste, disposal of soil. So everything is organized to make an environment healthy and to make an environment clean. But the concept always is that there has to be people doing their part and the government doing its part. So when from an informal settlement, now Orangi is a formal settlement of 2.1 million people. They have their own representatives in the parliament. They have local representatives. They have representatives in the federal parliament as well. And all this has come about because they were given the confidence that, yes, they could do what they thought was impossible, that is major development work. So this is how we have maintained. And as Erik said, it is still a pilot project because there are no two communities which will approach a problem in the same manner. There are no two templates. There is no one single template. And every time a community asks us to go and help them, it is starting from zero, which means we are learning. Those people are learning, and we learn and we teach them to look at development in this manner and look at the development you need. Do not, and you know, you cannot impose development on people. You have to first let them decide what is it they need, and then help them get to that in the most economical way possible, and in the most efficient way possible. And we know, we've just done a recent survey that the lines that were laid in 1982-83 still survive because the people have invested, they maintain it. Similarly for water lines, they laid themselves at the lane level, at the street level. So street power works. I mean, you have to mobilize them, you have to give them solutions, but it is also very important that they invest in it, not just emotionally, not just capacity-wise, but they also invest economically, because it is then that they get ownership, and it is then that they get a seat at the table with the government. So that's how it is, and this is the way we carry on. And we have gone beyond Karachi. We have gone into Pakistan. We have gone into the region, and there are many people who come to us to learn the model. So what we do is we've now become a teaching organization, a research organization, wherein we teach communities how to create this people-government partnership, which really works. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Celine and Akilah, for your impressive presentations and for highlighting, in fact, that the most significant development achievements need to be based on people's participation and on people's resources. And particularly the significant role that poor, marginalized women can play in the most dire of circumstances, in the streets, in the lanes, and in the guests. I think the work of SDI and the Orangi pilot project, they have gone to scale, are some of the most successful, if not the most successful, slum upgrading projects that exist. A lot to learn from that. So we are running a little bit out of time, 10, 15 minutes. We have to speed up, and the next SDG is on 11.5, reducing the number of disasters, and that topic is now coming up. I'm not sure if the disaster we are focusing now was in the minds of those who formulated and adopted Target 5. And I think they maybe might have thought of a pandemic, but it might have been another pandemic, to quote Norwegian Prime Minister. For the last 16 months, the world has been partly locked down and partly knocked down. So we have invited Eduardo Moreno, Head of Knowledge and Innovation at UN Habitat, to speak on the topic of people confronting pandemics and on other disasters. How to build and organize resilient streets in a dense or not so dense city. Some experiences. Eduardo, welcome.
Thank you very much, Erik. Can you hear me, colleagues? I'm fine here.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. Let me start addressing this important topic that was given to me by Habitat Norway by presenting three fundamental premises and then three proposals or three articulated responses to this. The premises are, the first one, to recall everyone that COVID is an urban crisis, and I'm going to explain why and how it connects to the level of neighborhood and the street. The second, the relation of COVID and global agendas, and then COVID and the need of societal changes. In October, when the Secretary General presented a policy brief report on COVID, UN Habitat and other studies highlighted that 95% of cases of COVID were happening in cities or urban areas. However, only 56% of the population live in these areas. This happened because the virus primarily spread in large cities that are the more connected, the better connected, where there are international links. Since October to now, UN Habitat has developed something that we call the City IQ, which is the most important global database on city responses about COVID, 1,700 cities. We know now that in the second and the third outbreak of COVID, secondary cities, small cities, rural areas were also seriously affected by COVID. However, even in these conditions, the pandemic will be considered an urban crisis. And I would like to tell you why. Because if you remember Ebola or H1N1 or any other epidemic or important pandemic in recent years, urban centers play a very central role in solving the problem of rural areas. We talk about the territorialization of the response in which regional planning play a major role. I would like to recall, for instance, at the end of 2015, when the Millennium Development Goals finalized and a final report associated to this was produced, it was mentioned that 700 million people were lifted out of poverty and 500 of them from rural areas. However, and this is the connection that I want to establish, in these 500 people living in rural areas, most of them, the great majority, were through urban-based planned activities. So instead of a dichotomy, we are looking at strong connection that will move us to neighborhoods and also to streets. Second point, global agendas, New Urban Agenda, SDGs, Paris Agreement, Accord, and others, they were not wrong. They continue to be with COVID, a manual of procedure. They are our navigation guide, the critical route, and they are also aspirational and very concrete in leading and telling us the way that we can go out of this situation, and recalling us that the old normal is not that it got tired for the new normal to come. That happened because there was a tragedy in the social, the economic, the environmental conditions with very high cost and with a moral toll. In other words, global agendas still can help us to think our action in cities and to move out in a definitive and sustainable manner of this crisis. Point number 3, any proposal at any level that we are going to make in the city, in the urban, will not take place if there are not necessary institutional and social changes. We need changes of social cohesion, of identity, of sense of belonging. I would even say proposing a revolution of empathy, and that can only happen at the city level, at the street level, the place where these societal relations are taking place. When the Secretary General was asking one moment, what was one of the most important changes that COVID brought, he mentioned something that was very close to what I call a change in the sense of place. We know now that a different urban and space design is needed, but what we need is a sense of place change. This will call for a rethinking the geography of proximity, of distance, of time, space, and also the mechanisms that regulate our societal interactions. And for that, streets play a fundamental role. They are not the founding block of planning and the system of cities. They are the beginning of societal relations and the way our civilization materializes and expresses. Streets are, and sometimes we tend to forget this, the scenario where an invisible fight between the public and the private is taking place. A fight that the public has been losing in last years. And we can express this, for instance, when we can see that public spaces and streets reduced by 20% in the last 25 years. This is interesting because we have more technology, stronger institutions, more presence and participation of civil society, but still the public is losing in the design, in the organization, in the way the city is being sold and presented. That's why we propose that urban planning should be brought as at a level not of technocratic exercise, but as a public good exercise. We need to democratize public space. And for that, participation is the beginning and the first step for that. But in many places, we need to acknowledge that participation appears more as a state concession. However, it should be a right that we need to learn how to make it viable in the urban space. I said 3 proposals, and because of time, I'm going to be very fast, but of course we can create conditions to come back to some of these elements and proposals with more time and the possibility of follow-up. The first one, we need to redraw the plans of the future of the cities, thinking in terms of connectivity, space, harmony, proximity, and a new mobility alliance. In fact, I suggest a pedagogy of mobility, streets that need to be green corridors, walkable corridors, and spaces of encounter. We need for that to rewrite the rules of place and context, and perhaps to redesign the maps of the environment, because all that is the way that we should govern our post-pandemic society, or a society learning to live with pandemics. That will bring a rebalance between the private and the public, and to recover this again as a public good. It will need to reestablish a balance between agents, public and private. It is estimated by our studies that more than 60–70% of cities, including all these new streets, were built, designed, and conceived by the private sector with very little participation of public local authorities. We need to rethink optimal densities and to find the good equation of what this means in our spaces But in order to that, we need an ethical pact, one that revalue the commons and the spaces. Second proposition to this important webinar. I think it will be important to reinvent a new urban history, one that redesigned the pedestrian city and the city of the bicycle. Up to now, in many places in the world, this is the case, for instance, in Nairobi, where I am, mobility is imposed to us. We need to have a chosen mobility in which we could perhaps recover this old idea, which in fact exists, of the homo viator, the man that walks, the philosophy of walking, the man who recovers the anthropological sense of the trip, of the journey in the city. That will be a huge leap in humanity to recover our own environment. We need to stop thinking in a final destination in the journey, but to focus on the moments, on the steps, on the opportunities to think about ourselves, reaffirm our identity. And streets are the privileged space for doing this, building a new narrative of who we are and which is our culture. Like this, perhaps we will recover the forgotten space that the streets represent. And to think that environment and street associated with the possibility of not thinking that we are forgetting places and this sort of anesthesia of physical places that we don't see, we don't feel, we don't hear anymore. By walking, by cycling, we will rebuild the memory of the place and perhaps also rethink silence and noises, to recover our neighborhood, to recover ourselves, and to share this space. Walking in this second proposal would represent recovering the ecological city, getting closer to the nature, and recovering the street as the funding element of this proposal. Point number 3 and last one, because of time. In this post-COVID society, UN Habitat has published recently, and I have the opportunity to present also with our colleagues of Norway and Habitat, the report Citizen Pandemic. And now that we analyze what is happening in cities and what are the best practices in terms of response to the pandemic, we understand that one of the key elements to deal with the perspective of health and ecology and a future environment and future conditions is to change at the very local level the form and the function of the city. This means, as I said before, rethinking connectivity, proximity, density, but also to redesign the street at the very local level with housing regulations and to respond to the pandemic from a perspective of public health crisis. If we do this, and this is the proposal, we should start designing and thinking in the resilience of cities in terms of sustainable, self-contained ecological neighborhoods. This is, in many parts of the world, the best option in response to the pandemic. That happened in cities where the number of people with contagion and death was minimum because they were reestablishing from the very neighborhood level a response to that. Urban areas that are in fact specific neighborhoods with adequate public spaces, services, amenities that have their own local health and education solutions that recreate in the street and the space local community organizations. And the most functional unit for this will be the neighborhood that we will connect to the city and the region, passing, of course, by rural-urban interlinkages, and prepare a response to these streets that will be different from what we have today. Rethinking this urban planning can happen only.
Thank you very much, Eduardo.
Sustainable solutions.
We are running out of time.
Now. Yes, I finish. I would say it's just to reshape
the
need urban
morphology for a global discourse on new urban development models and approaches for the future, based on some of the principles that you mentioned, density, connectiveness, proximity, and new forms of mobility. And I really hope that you, in your present position in UN Habitat, will open up and facilitate a discussion where the streets, the lanes, the gates are the basis for human settlement development. Thank you very much. Our last thematic intervention this afternoon relates to SDG 11, Target 6, on air quality and waste. We face a situation in almost every city and town and settlement all over the world where people need to reclaim the space occupied by cars right outside their front door. 7 million people are dying each year from air pollution and lack of security, resulting in higher mortality than malaria, HIV AIDS, and tuberculosis combined. So we have asked André Zikus, he is the Chief of Urban Basic Services at UN Habitat, to give us an outline of the findings and the recommendations of a recently completed research project from several major African cities on car traffic, effects on children, and of course, approaches to remedy the situation. Take it away, André.
Thank you very much, Erik, and hi, colleagues. I'm just quickly trying to upload my presentation. Can you see it? No. Please confirm if you can see my presentation, because I'm presenting it.
I cannot see your presentation.
You can't see it? Okay, let's see if it works. 1 second. Start presentation. Share. Okay, sorry, it's not working. So I'll just leave out the presentation, colleagues, just to save time. Thank you very much. Well, thanks, Erik, and thank you very much, and welcome to the Habitat Norway Forum on really focusing us on SDG 11.6. And I'd also like to make reference to SDG 11.2. And as Eduardo spoke, we can really split the city into two spheres. One is the sphere of the private space, which is our houses, to which we have very limited access. And then we have the sphere of the public space, which is accessible to all. And if we think about streets, they are this public space. And in terms of streets, they are transitional. So they connect us as people to jobs, education, healthcare, social services, economic opportunities, and recreation. But they're also, if you want to say, stationary. So they're places where we have hawkers selling informal goods, we have children playing, and also where we meet as communities. And on the other hand, the streets are also our extensions of our houses. They sort of act as our open air living rooms. Very often in many societies, people go out in the evenings and eat on the streets and socialize. So one of the things, if we look at it, how much time do we spend in streets? And we can see that in the global north, people spend about 90 minutes per day on the streets during the week, and nearly double the amount during the weekends. Now, one of the questions which comes up to us is really, what do we want to experience when we are outside of our house for nearly 13 hours? And the second question is, what do we want to experience? And the reality is, for the first question, when we go out and we're outside of our houses for 13 hours, we experience traffic jams, speeding cars, noise and air pollution, and the eyesore and smell of solid waste management and wastewater piling up in our streets. On the other hand, many people are yearning for streets where we can really spend more time with our friends, enjoy nature, and also breathe fresh air. So these streets, as they are designed and engineered, but they are also something organic, because we as humans actually use the streets and we make our decisions on the streets and how we use them, and we form our communities. So if we look at that, how our streets are looking is actually something like a window into the soul of the city, or into the soul of this living entity, which is a city. And it is also a mirror of our own culture and society. So if we really want to get the streets right, we have to design them based on human values, which respect the needs and the rights of all people. And I'd like to sort of give you some concrete examples from UN Habitat in the area of waste and also on pollution. Now, if we think about waste, we should look at this in a broader context and look at also how we're wasting space, how we're wasting time, and also how we're wasting the lives and the health of our people. Many streets allocate a lot of space towards private cars. When we go through our streets, we see many cars parked on these streets worth billions and millions of dollars. And cars are actually parked 95% of the time. Out of 168 hours in a week, the average car on the road is only 9 hours. So that's actually a very inefficient use of space and very inefficient use of our vehicles. And the average car will actually see its value drop by 45 cents every hour we're parking it out on the street as depreciation. And of course, when we're in motion, what we're experiencing is traffic jams. Some cities have actually developed commuter pain indexes. And if we take, for instance, the city of Bogota in Colombia, the Bogotans actually spend 272 hours, which is 10 days every year in traffic jams. In Cairo, just as an impact in terms of loss in GDP, Cairo loses about $8 billion a year due to traffic jams. In Uganda, 10 people each day lose their lives in road accidents, and those are mainly pedestrians and cyclists. 300 million children live in environments where air pollution exceeds 6 times the international guidelines. 570,000 people die from largely traffic-related air pollution every year. All these people don't have fair and equal access to streets. Streets thus need to be reclaimed for the users of non-motorized transport, for public transport, social interaction, leisure, and economic opportunity. To deliver these inclusive streets, Habitat has sort of in general given a guideline that we should be allocating 30 to 35% of our public space towards streets. And if we're speaking about streets, we're not speaking about highways and flyovers. We're speaking about prosperous streets which are well connected with densities, but then also allowing for transport modes such as public transport, walking, and cycling. If we go to slum areas, low-income areas like Kibera, the street space only allocated is about 12% of land use. So there is actually quite an intense pressure on those streets in the slums to deliver the necessary functions a street should be giving. So what we've done in Habitat, we've done an innovative study where we used sensors, stress sensors, brainwave stress sensors with children to actually measure the stress a child goes through when it walks in the morning from the house to the school. So we've measured these stresses and we've combined the stresses in the children with real-time data on air and noise pollution along the street in Kibera. And we've also done surveys on this. And based on these walkthrough surveys, we've actually been able to identify and pinpoint the stress areas for the children and then define and devise urban planning interventions to improve the noise and pollution situation to make the walk of a child actually more pleasant. As another example, our Urban Pathways project, which looks at mobility, energy, and waste in streets, we've started a program on eco zones. So we've worked in Belo Horizonte, and Belo Horizonte is a very car-oriented city, where we, in an area called Santa Teresa, set up a neighborhood into an eco-zone where for 1 week, the cars were actually banned and people were reclaiming the public space. There was traffic calming, bicycles were used to move around, and green spaces were created. And this actually resulted in a great environmental improvement in this area, and of course also building the community. In addition, we've also done open street events in Habitat in both Africa and Latin America. And in an example, in Nairobi, we started a traffic calming public space initiative. And this initiative, by measuring the air pollution in this area, we could demonstrate that the air pollution levels reduced by 50% in this community. So this was evidence which we could use to feed into sustainable urban mobility plans into other cities to actually traffic calm, and you will then reduce the air pollution in those areas. And this temporary experiments, which we've done in Nairobi and Kampala, have now become permanent features on some of the streets in those cities. Now, if we look at the streets, it's not just a question of pollution and mobility, it's also a question of waste management. The collection of waste is very much determined how our streets are designed and laid out. And of course, the littering and the blocked sewers, which we see in our streets, is also a sort of view into how healthy the waste management system is in a city. We should also keep in mind that the streets actually generate 2% of plastic wastes in streets. And through our executive director and the Waste My Cities initiative, what we try to do is we really try to promote 5 R's when we speak about waste management in streets. That's to rethink how we do waste, to refuse waste, to reduce waste, to reuse waste, and recycle waste. And as part of our program, the WasteWise Cities program, we have started a WasteWise diagnostic tool, which is based on the SDG indicator 11.6.1, where we work with cities on analyzing what kind of waste is generated and making suggestions on how the waste management can be improved in the city and coming up with clear points for interventions. Another example, in addition to these city diagnosis tools and guiding cities on improving their waste management systems through transfer stations, other examples and investments, is that we've worked with the Lebanese Ministry of Environment, where we've set up reverse vending machines in the city where people could dump their empty packaging containers, and they were actually provided with mobile call credit in return for actually dropping their waste. Other cities have done this in Indonesia on buses, where you would bring your bottles and put those bottles into the recyclables bin, and they would get a free bus ride out of this. I'd like to sort of finish my presentation with an example from Afghanistan, where we've actually worked, our colleagues have worked from UN Habitat with 12 municipalities in actually providing job opportunities for urban poor through a Clean and Green Cities program in Afghanistan, which was really focusing on setting up public waste bins, solid waste collection, and street sweeping, and of course, increasing the pride of the cities. So with this, dear colleagues, I'd really like to thank you very much for your attention, giving you a quick overview of the linkages between streets, waste management, and air pollution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, André, for a most stimulating presentation. I think what you just have told us, what you just have presented, underscores very much the importance of Habitat's normative work. And I think Norway has a lot to benefit from a partnership with UN Habitat on research on adaptive approaches to urban development. So Norway should take up again, based on the knowledge and experience we have gained through 40 years of cooperation with UN Habitat, We should take up again our partnership that was so disgracefully cut last year, as I said, after 40 years of collaboration. So thank you very much, Eduardo and André. So, after 3 hours, we have finally reached the summing up part of our webinar, Every Street Matters. The topic is almost obvious, given this morning's government conference on the SDG action plan. The title is The Street in Light of the UN SDGs and Norwegian Practice. So I invite to the rostrum Ellen Wibe, former Chief Town Planner of Oslo, now board member of Habitat Norway, Master of Science in Town Science, and highly profiled activist. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Erik. It's a bit late in the day, but let's hope we stay awake still, although it's a digital webinar. The UN SDGs reminds us of the imperative important challenges we are facing. And today we expected the Norwegian government to pass a white paper and an action plan for implementing the SDGs. Unfortunately, it didn't come when they had their webinar this morning, but let's hope it comes before the summer holidays. At the webinar, I would just quote a few things that was said. For instance, a CEO said that we need not new technology, we need new behavioral changes. And CFO said that sustainability is also about social dimensions. That was the head of the Finance Norway. And the head of the pension fund, Norwegian pension fund, said they would now start a test of cautiousness before allowing companies to enter into the portfolio. And a biologist, Dag Hessen, said that the market economy may contribute, but cannot be based on material growth alone. That is some of the challenges we face. Let's see. However, our common challenges, as I said, are huge. You know Kate Roever, who points out clearly in her donut economy theory that we need completely new ways of accounting for the reuse of our resources. Our bottom line economy prevents appropriate strategies, she says. Fundamentally, our actions have to stay within the limits of the capacity of the planet, or the donut, the green circle on the illustration, no more and no less. As we have seen very clearly in previous presentations today, our individual actions matter. The world has huge variations on how climate friendly we live, as you can see from this illustration. Norway is not doing very well. We may ask, to what degree does our high level of consumption comply with the principles of climate friendliness and human rights? I will not run through how horse carriage roads have been turned into congested and polluted motorways. We all know that. But let's just reflect on the essence of the city and the street. The city is an arena for exchange of goods, travel, modes, ideas, and love, as the Lord Mayor said previously today. It's the space for achieving climate adaptation and biodiversity. It is the place you live, you grow up as a child, and you produce a product for sale. In other words, it's the place you move about to cater for your household. It's a tool, the city is a tool for our lives. And the Lord Mayor also mentioned Jon Pløger today. As she said, there may be friction and struggle, but in sociological terms, the city has a particular role as a meeting place. And Jon Pløger mentions, for instance, it creates safety in the closeness of the stranger you confide in, the people you meet that you otherwise wouldn't meet. It creates the informal community through simultaneous routine actions. It creates the aestheticizing community where our glances occupies the space and give it meaning. And I think Anna Falu referred to Anne Michaud earlier, which has also said the same, how the glance is an important part of our meeting place. And the city also creates spatio-temporal community when people meet completely unplanned and non-repetitively. The city of Oslo had the car-free livability program going for 3 years. And it was about bettering the environment, pollution-wise, but also increasing city life. Different pilot projects and activities and physical refurbishments were carried out. But most importantly, I think it was related to the administration of the city opening up to the world outside, the businesses, the NGOs, the innovators, the citizens. New shareholders and voices came forth, especially the young people. The need for new methods of planning, the use of public land became obvious, and we turned the traffic hierarchy around, giving pedestrians and green mobility priority. Salvador Rueda, the Spanish biologist, introduced the superblock concept in Barcelona. You can see his drawing here, showing how poorly we cater for pedestrians very often. Superblocks, however, view the streets as the basic arena for family and social life in the city. And when we carried out the car-free livability program, after 1 year, today I think the results may be slightly different, probably due to the pandemic, but half of the respondents said they wanted more car-free streets in the city center, they wanted more car-free streets generally, and they were willing to drive less to meet climate goals. Simultaneously, you see that a quarter of the population were against these things. Railroads and motorways often restrict people's equity and use of city, so also in Norway. When the fringe city is being urbanized, it is important to downscale and redesign the roads into streets that make it easy for pedestrians to get across to wherever they want to go. Making streets arena for city life commercially, socially and aesthetically also requires new modes of transport, and we did smile a bit when we saw this plumber transporting a water closet on his bicycle. Human innovation and human scale is important. The development of streets is very much a project of democracy. We've heard that earlier today. And the city of Oslo has different types of design guidelines, for instance, requiring 1,000 square meters of public space, not communal space, but public space, per 20,000 square meters of floor space. But a space code is not enough. A striking characteristic from the car-free livability program was the need to cooperate with different shareholders. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes not. These photographs are from the socioeconomic less affluent district of Furuset, where an area improvement program has been carried on for about 10 years in collaboration with the local community and NGOs. Is that? No. And the Danes have a theory that which they called the municipality 3.0. After the war, municipality 1.0 was when people came quite modestly to the local authority and asked to be allowed to buy some building materials. Municipality 2.0 was in the 80s, when during public participation, especially related to services for elderly people, the city was still the one that always decided. They listened, but they always decided. Now, with Municipality 3.0, we are in a period of shared responsibility and co-creation, where civil society are an equal partner. That puts a lot of challenges into public administration, I think. And I would just like to show you some physical elements that I think are important. For instance, the local historic building that gives identity to a new transformed housing area and refurbishment or restructuring of an industrial area. On the right bottom, immigrants leisurely fishing alongside the harbour promenade. This lady I talked to on Friday, she and her husband had caught 20 mackerel that very day. And to the top right, restructuring of a street at Ensjø, where the local brook also is reopened. But it is also, as the Lord Mayor said, a struggle for the right to the city. Street space is limited. Even if town planners have codes, there will be a constant struggle related to the use of the urban space. And this example from Tjuvholmen in Oslo, a very sort of hot summer, popular seafront, caretaker for expensive dwellings, fencing off the bathing jetty. That made that resulted in an uproar from the public. The area was developed by private developers, but the main street and the seafront zoned as public space. And I remember at the time that our Tory deputy mayor for urban development, Bård Folke Fredriksen, said at the time, important spaces to the public should be zoned for public use, Ellen. I think that's quite impressive coming from a Tory politician. Another aspect, participation often happens too late and superficially. I'm quite used to working under representative democracy, but it doesn't always work. George Monbiot in The Guardian says that policy making needs more influence from participatory democracy, like participatory budgeting, for instance, in Scotland or at Tøyen, Greenland, which is now being tested out. And here you see Extension Rebellion and myself demonstrating in front of the post-war historic monument, the Y Block, part of the federal government quarters attacked by the terrorists in 2011. Now this building is demolished, unfortunately. But I think perhaps it will help for other projects in the future. Gender has also been a topic today. And we see how important it is for well-being and for prosperity. Not only in the global south, but also in Europe, unsafe public spaces are becoming a serious challenge. For instance, in our neighboring country, Sweden. Eva Storesen's Pavilion project in Old Stone Town at Zanzibar, giving different types of layered and shielded spaces for women, could also be applicable to elderly people and children. In European cities, different types of temporary or permanent outdoor facilities, also unisex ones, are becoming more popular. I'm sure that we can learn from each other how to locate, design and light up these spaces. Because, as Anna Falu said earlier today, safe cities for women are safe cities for all. And sometimes there's struggle, but sometimes there's only competition. And there are competing interests and uses. To the left, you see, some of you see, a map from Susanna Hall that talked previously today. And what we see is that improvement projects tend to gentrify areas. Simultaneously, different users groups have different needs. The left drawing, as I said, from Susanna Hall, of a street in Bristol showed the country of origin for the different uses of vendors of the street. And other drawings she has show how the pattern of origin changes over time. In Oslo, we have a somewhat shabby and unsafe square underneath a motorway at Grønland. During doing up the square temporarily has been part of an area improvement program. The ethnically Norwegian part of the population has wanted playground facilities, and the pavements have been painted, and last winter a skating rink was installed. However, an alternative has been proposed for food market based on global food traditions that could enable immigrant women to have income of their own. None of these activities are better than the other. The main challenge, however, is how to create a participatory democracy that allows for a combination of these needs. Or put in another way, whom are we gentrifying for? Oops. Will cater for the needs of the public at large the best. It may be of high architectural quality, or it may be simpler architectural quality. If it is located and has a value of excellence, it will be used whatever. Finally, very quickly, a few comments about biodiversity and climate. The network of public spaces is important for climate adaptation, as I think we've heard from Moreno today as well. Oslo have for about 3 decades, I think, made the river structure our urban development. Riverbanks have been opened, the water has been purified, and flood maps give fundamental premises to how to densify the city ahead. And rewilding the city is important for both people and biodiversity. To the top right, when my granddaughter jumps energetically into the recently purified water Harbour Sea and the naturally and quickly purified Alna River at Grorud, or the reopened Hovin stream, we are sure it makes us and nature thrive. And of course, nature is an important basis for urban agriculture as well as for living creatures like birds and animals. With 100,000 new trees planted and educating children in cultivating the soil, there is a hope for reaching the UN SDGs, I think, within the next 10 or 9 years. The streets and public spaces must cater for all types of activities and beings. They may also exhibit the UN SDGs to everybody, like here in Aarhus. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you for summing up 15 interventions during the course of 3 hours in an excellent way, and doing it against the backdrop of the struggle for the city in Oslo. Just let me mention that you could find the whole webinar on YouTube. And please feel free to delve into the many fascinating presentations that have been made today. So, Ellen, you will now go on moderating the panel discussions. We have representatives from 3 political parties, as well as a representative from the Norwegian Housing Association. You are all very, very welcome. Please come to the rostrum, and Ellen will take care of you.
Hvordan skal vi bruke? We have 2 questions, and we'll do them separately, I think. The first one goes as follows. Development is, in its broadest meaning, a question of power distribution. We all share the concept of popular participation, power sharing, and decentralization, implying that social and political issues should be dealt with at the most local level that is consistent with their solution. Having listened to the afternoon's presentations, how could we set up mechanisms that observe the principle of subsidiarity? And I give the word to Rasmus Reinwang, the political secretary for the Deputy Mayor of Urban Development. No, are you still the Deputy? Now you are the assistant to the Deputy Mayor. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen. One thing I notice when I'm working for the city government as a politician, and when we get visitors from abroad, I often talk about the whole Oslo and what we're doing and how we're working. And then gradually I found out that one thing that really interests a lot of visitors, especially from Global South or Far East, is that we have a system of database where every street, every building, every plot, if something is planned there, you can see it on the website. So you can log into a certain municipal website, and there's all information about what is planned, who's thinking about doing what, how far have they come in the process, and what is happening. And my point is just saying that if you want to have real participation at every level, you need to have information at every level. And information empowers, and I think that's an important tool for us all to consider. Thank you.
You can present yourself.
Thank you. My name is Anne Beate Tvinnereim. I am head of planning in Viken County and deputy of one of the Norwegian parties, the Centre Party. Very interesting point on information from my colleague Rasmus. I would also like to add to that organization is an absolute must if you are to really do the bottom-up approach. And I think that the starting point for that is always building the sense of commitment to a local community. You know, if you have that pride, that identity to your local community, that creates ownership and hopefully organization around the local issues. So that is one important thing. And if you're able to get some funding, could be projects. I mean, it could be any type of funding that really helps the grassroots movements. I would also like to mention that in Norway we have a social scientist that once said, "Votes count, resources decide," and that is a recurring challenge in this topic. You know, politicians can always be influenced by the major capital. And in Norway, for instance, in my daily work, we have to adhere to a very strict national legal framework on how to involve the population. However, in order for us to involve the local population, they need to organize. So again, organization is very important. Thank you.
Do my job and introduce Anders Roever Larsen, a long experience on urban planning in Oslo in various positions. I won't say anymore. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And that, I think, is also my introduction as a former advisor for the city government, but also a member of the city council. And now I'm the local mayor of the district of Grorud. And then I find this question very relevant and interesting to discuss. I think that participation and ownership is easier to get when you work locally. I see it through my political work. The levels of power is challenging and also often a subject of conflicts. I did my master's degree on mediation and conflict resolution, and my master's thesis found or focused on the local area of Groruddalen, or my street or my backyard. The area is densely populated and developed from rural zone into one of Norway's largest residential areas during the 60s and 70s. Ellen had some in her presentation about that. The population grew about 572% from 1949 until 1980. And Groruddalen is an area of great challenges regarding industrial activities, car traffic, living conditions, environmental issues, and air pollution. But also one of the places where people don't make their voice heard, they don't protest, they don't vote, not as much as other inhabitants of the city. So the locals in this area, they feel that there's a conflict, and the people described to me in my interviews for this degree that they felt left outside. I think the solution is to focus on all parts of the city, to include all kind of people, young people, elderly people, people with less resources, and you also need to make universal solutions and work along the equality line.
Thank you, Anders. The last and odd one out this evening is Christian Marius Stryken. He's not a politician, but he works for a very important body in Norway, which is the Norwegian Housing Association. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellen, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're still awake. It's a very warm and beautiful night in Oslo, so we are somewhat dizzy, although we had a coffee. Anyhow, I do work for the Norwegian Cooperative Housing Association, and that is a very important distinction, and I will explain why. But before I do so, I would like to agree to two of the previous speakers. Information is key, organization is key, but commitment is essential. Commitment is what makes you act. And that's when we come back to the Norwegian Cooperative Housing Association. We are an organization of 1.1 million people, and we call the members house owners. They are owners of flats and different types of houses. And that's a very special feature of the way in which the Norwegian society is organized. For the last decades, 80% of the population has been owners of their own houses. If you compare to most European capitals and many other countries, it's quite unique. But the thing is, they don't just own their own houses, they own their houses jointly. They own houses together. That's why we call our organization for a cooperative housing organization. And if you own your own house, and you have practical problems, you have environmental problems, you have maybe social issues in your environment, well, if you own something together, you try to solve the problems together too. So coming back to your question, the redistribution of power, well, it has always been the power of the owners, and they run the larger corporation. Of course, there are frictions from time to time, but still the power is in the hands of the house owners. Thank you.
Thank you. And when you say house owners, you mean dwelling owners, because it could be single-family houses or it could be flats and things like that. Yes. Let's move to the next question. I'll read it up. Many Western countries, including Norway, have a high level of consumption, for instance, related to construction works of technical infrastructure like streets and public spaces. We should, in order to meet the Paris Treaty, primarily purchase short-traveled materials. We often need, however, supply of materials and products from other continents. Will your institution or political party secure Norwegian legislation demanding compliance to the UN human rights rules and safe working conditions when we make these procurements? Buying so much, it will make a difference. We go in the opposite order, I think, so we can start.
I'm in the privileged position of not being a politician on this issue, and I'm not struggling to find a way in which to shape a new governmental platform for this fall's election. But as a representative of a cooperative housing movement, which is global, I can assure you the answer is yes, that's something we really support. And we can find ways of arguing in favor by looking at our criteria, which is international criteria. We have concern for the community, is one principle. We are very much focusing on membership, economic participation. And from economic participation, there's another notion which is called emancipation. So the core principles, to put it simply, in our movement, in all its shapes and forms globally, is a vote for yes.
Yeah, I represent the Labour Party, and of course we are into this, and also now in the city of Oslo we made this Oslo model that we want to do nationally, where those working on commission from the city of Oslo should mainly be on permanent contracts. At least 50% of those carrying out the work should be certified. There should be at least 10% apprentices in areas where this is needed, and all workers must be registered from day one, and a lot of other criteria that we also now want to do nationally, and also when we both buy products, but also have workers from abroad.
It's my turn. Thank you. This is a really interesting issue, and it, in my view, procurement issues it's a very interesting and under-communicated. Under-communicated. Thank you. It's so late in the day. Political tool. It's a really interesting political tool to develop. We heard from Oslo that they have implemented it. In my county, in Viken, we have recently implemented procurement tools that emphasize both social and environmental elements, as well as emphasizing local procurement in order to get local jobs. However, in terms of international procurement, my party, the Center Party, will definitely work towards such international rules and implement them. The question is, what to emphasize when you do procurements. And for too many decades, price has been the only sort of relevant question that politicians have asked. But I feel that there is a change in the air that concerned citizens and engaged citizens are more aware of the issue, and therefore approaching politicians saying, we are not only concerned about price, we want the ethical standards as well. However, one issue is that for many decades, the international guidelines on procurements, for example, in the WTO, has been a hinder in that work, and that means that, again, concerned citizens need to put pressure on local communities, local politicians, who again can fight for these standards on a national and international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The answer is yes. I'll expand a little bit. I mean, we have a lot of treatises in the UN. We need a sustainable planet, economically, socially. We have 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, all public procurement should contribute to us reaching those goals and not maintaining structures keeping us away from reaching those goals. And that goes internally in every country, like in Norway for our sake, but also when we trade with the rest of the world. And not only that, my party has a very radical also take on Norwegian economy. We have an immense sovereign wealth fund built up by petroleum money, more than $1,354 billion, which we today invest blindly in all kinds of status quo global economy companies. We believe that big treasure of money, which has actually been created by selling oil, should be set into work to contribute to sustainable development goals all over the planet, and so that we not only procure but also invest to create the planet we actually want. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was quite enough as a concluding comment. If we manage that, we've really done the job well. I gather that we all support some kind of participatory democracy. Of course, there are lots of dilemmas when you do big infrastructure developments and so on. There will always be difficulties in handling local needs. But basically, there is an approach to catering for this. And when it comes to the procurement, I'm sure, for instance, Rasmus means both public and private procurement should adhere to these principles. And then we have the good advice from Anne-Beate that the WTO perhaps is the biggest hindrance. So I think we'll take that with us. So thank you very much for enlightening us and giving some concrete advices. And then I give the word back to Erik Berg. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the representatives of the political parties of Oslo and Viken, and also to the Cooperative Association of Norway. This is just the beginning of the end, so I just want the political representatives to wait a little bit, because Habitat Norway has formulated 6 issues, 6 questions to the present government and to the political parties in Parliament. So I would very much like to use this opportunity to hand over to you the letter that we have written and was sent this morning to the political parties. And I can assure you that even if we are a small organization, we usually say that we are the smallest of all important organizations, but we have the biggest board, which represents our voluntarity. So we will knock on your doors with this letter. Either you are in Parliament or you are in the City Hall. And again, thank you very much for coming on this very nice summer evening. Most appreciated. Thank you. And with these few words, we thank all participants. We thank the speakers, and we thank the organizers, the Polytechnical Association of Norway, Mette, and Vetle's team for an impressive performance. We have brought together speakers from Canada in the West, Argentine, Nairobi in Africa, Kenya, Karachi, and China, Beijing, and of course also London, UK. Thank you very much.